Chapter 288. As soon as the door of the cabin was closed, Jinwan's heart sank to the bottom, but at the same time, hope rose. Mo Jingshan was still alive. A moment ago, he was standing in front of her. Although Mo Jingshan's attitude was unbelievably cold, Jinwan more or less knew his keenness and decisiveness. If he had shown any trace of a relationship with her just now, she would have been killed by Dolly's gun in an instant. But now that she finally found him, she couldn't even say a word to him, and had to suffer his indifference. Even the food was knocked over. Jinwan felt a little depressed, but more because she heard that he hadn't eaten anything for 3 days and 3 nights. Dolly walked out with a cold face. Obviously, he was annoyed by Mo Jingshan's attitude. He turned back and urged Jinwan to go faster, his tone very unkind. Jinwan followed him quietly, getting farther and farther away from the cabin where Mo Jingshan was. And she didn't look back. Mo Jingshan's attitude was very obvious. Here, whether it was him or her, any carelessness could lead to serious consequences, or even death on the spot. He was already careful, so she should be more cautious. No matter whether she could save him or not, she should at least not hold him back. Jinwan certainly didn't know that since she left the cabin, there were more than a dozen guns pointed at her in the dense forest around her. Once she looked back or looked at the cabin, she would be shot to death. The old woman was still waiting in Akib's cabin. Hearing the noise outside and seeing that Jinwan had come back safe and sound, she immediately said a few words in Cambodian to Akib, who had been expressionless, with a happy look on her face. Akib obviously didn't expect that Jinwan was really not sent to rescue Mo Jingshan. Although he still looked at Jinwan with cold and sharp eyes, he no longer paid attention to her. He waved his hand, and motioned the old woman to take her out first. Jinwan followed the old woman out, and glimpsed some small white flowers around. These flowers were not common in China, and she could still smell their strong fragrance from a long distance. If she remembered correctly, this should be the national flower of Cambodia, Lunda flower. Seeing that Jinwan had been looking at these flowers, and seemed to be interested in them, the old woman took her over with a smile, bent over, picked a few flowers, and handed them to her. Jinwan looked at the old woman in surprise, pointed to the flowers, and then pointed to herself, meaning that she could take these flowers? The old woman nodded and was about to speak, but remembering that she didn't understand, she just smiled, put the flowers in her hand, and took Jinwan back to the cooking tent. Although this old woman was respected by the people here, she was actually a servant who was responsible for washing and cooking. She lived in a very simple and damp cabin next to the cooking tent, and then she asked Jinwan to live with her. Because she had seen Mo Jingshan today, Jinwan was a little relieved, so she behaved more prudently, and listened to the old woman's arrangements. After entering the tent, the old woman found a white dress for her to change into, and then gave her a very thin quilt. It could be seen that this old woman had no companion all year round. It was not easy to meet a young girl in a place full of wild men. She really hoped that Jinwan wouldn't be killed by these people, and hoped that Jinwan could stay and help her cook. In the evening, Jinwan and the old woman were busy preparing dinner and sending it to Akib's room. Every time Akib saw Jinwan, he would stare at her for a while. Jinwan kept her head down. If she was too calm, it would only arouse suspicion, so her hands holding the bowl were trembling faintly. She looked helpless and pitiful, as if she was very afraid of everyone here. The short fat man who had caught Jinwan was also in this room. Seeing her come in, he suddenly smiled and turned to Akib and murmured something in Cambodian. Akib ignored him, but a man next to him suddenly said in English, "This woman's skin is really white, which is rare in Asia. It's like the snow I saw on the snowy mountains. Her face is also very small, and her eyes are big and bright like stars. She has a good figure, slender waist, and plump buttocks. She's so sexy." Then the people in the room suddenly began to speak in English. Some of them were very proficient in English, and some spoke poorly, but at least Jinwan could understand them. They were all infuriating erotic words that were extremely unpleasant to the ears. They could have spoken Cambodian, but they chose to speak English. It was clear that they were still testing her. Jinwan had been standing beside the old woman with her neck shrunk, as if she hadn't heard anything, and still looked scared and timid. Then suddenly someone next to Akib said, "There are a lot of farms near Tunnel Sap Lake. And there are many women. But it's really hard to find such a white and tender woman. We haven't had a good time in a long time because of Mr. Control. If this woman serves us well for a few days, when the operation is over, we can just throw her on the bed to satisfy our cravings." The room instantly roared with laughter. The men's gazes on Jinwan became even more unkind. They could no longer be described as simply wretched. Jinwan's heart chilled and she felt disgusted, but she still hid behind the old woman timidly. Then these people saw that she really didn't seem to hear them, so they switched back to Cambodian. After dinner, Akib suddenly said in English while wiping his mouth, "Dolly, ask this woman to continue to send food to Control. Tell him that if he refuses to eat, it means that the food this woman cooks is not to his taste. She is a waste, and it's useless to keep her alive. If he doesn't eat, we'll kill her." Jinwan felt a chill on her back. Hadn't Akib finished testing her? No matter whether Mo Jingshan ate the food she sent or not, she would face a dead end. Now even if she resisted by committing suicide, she would still face a dead end, and she might even implicate him. Dolly quickly agreed, grinned and said, "Okay, I'll ask her to go right away." With that he came over, stood in front of Jinwan, and glanced at her coldly. Without speaking, he just signaled her to go out with him with his eyes. Chapter 289. Seeing her like this, Dolly muttered something that Jinwan couldn't understand. She guessed that he must have said something like trouble, or something like that. Jinwan went to the cooking tent. Outside, Dolly kicked over the kettle set up outside the tent, telling her with his eyes to hurry up. He was very impatient now. Jinwan nodded at him. Most of the people here were ferocious. She had to be careful with every step she took, and not offend them easily. Dolly looked at her coldly from outside the tent. Jinwan shrank inside, holding a small bowl, filled herself with soup with trembling hands, and then carefully took a sip. Seeing that she was really hungry, Dolly stopped looking at her and let her drink, but he still urged her in an impatient tone. Jinwan pretended not to hear him, and glanced out from time to time as she drank the soup. When Dolly went to the cabin next door to grab a cigarette from another man's hand to smoke, Jinwan quickly stirred the pot with her hands. Looking at the bubbling soup in the pot, she suddenly made up her mind and knocked over the pot with her hands. In an instant, the hot soup splashed out and drenched the backs of her hands and wrists. She screamed in pain, fell back, and plopped to the ground. Hearing the noise, Dolly rushed back in an instant, lifted the curtain of the tent and looked in, only to see that the pot on the fire had been knocked over and spilled all over the ground. Jinwan sat on the ground, trembling in pain, and the back of her hand was instantly scalded with blisters. The blisters were so red that it was unbearable to look at. Dolly immediately cursed outside, walked in, grabbed Jinwan by the collar, and pulled her up without mercy. Jinwan was almost dragged out of the tent by him. When he came out, he was about to kick her when the old woman happened to come back at this time. She shouted and hurried over to rescue Jinwan from his hands. She looked at Jinwan's hands with distress and asked her a lot of questions, as if she was caring for her and blaming her. Jinwan really didn't understand this time. She could only try to make herself look particularly pitiful, innocent and scared. She looked at the old woman with red eyes full of tears, scared and aggrieved, raised her blistered hands, pointed to her stomach and mouth, and then to the bowl on the ground in the tent. The old woman knew that she hadn't eaten much since she was caught yesterday. Seeing that Jinwan's hands were so scalded, it was difficult for her to move, let alone deliver food. After the old woman said a few words to Dolly, he looked at Jinwan coldly with displeasure, obviously not intending to let her go. Akib asked her to deliver food to Control, but in the blink of an eye, her hands were scalded like this. Whether it was a coincidence or she did it on purpose, this woman couldn't be left alive now. The old woman had been defending Jinwan, so Dolly turned around with a cold face, went back to the cabin where Akib was, and reported the situation. The old woman helped Jinwan up, and kept speaking Cambodian. It seemed that she was distressed about Jinwan's hands, and asked her what was going on. Jinwan didn't make any sound, but followed her into the shabby cabin next to her with her head down. Now the back of Jean Wan's hands hurt badly when they were touched, and the scalded places felt like they were on fire. The old woman came over with a needle, pressed her hands forcibly, and pricked them one by one. Jean Wan trembled all over with pain, but she bit her lips hard. This time, her eyes were not red because she pretended to be afraid and wronged, but because of the pain, and tears welled up in her eyes. She had never suffered such heart-wrenching pain in her 2 lives, and her lips were bleeding from biting. Afterward, the old woman brought over some kind of medicine, which seemed to be a plant powder exclusive to Southeast Asian countries. It was gray and white, and she sprinkled it on the back of her hand. Then she cut off a strip from the bottom of Jean Wan's white dress, wrapped it around the back of her hand and wrist, and patted her hand, indicating that she should rest tonight and not go to work. Jean Wan nodded gratefully to the old woman. Out of the instinct of an innocent person who was caught, Jean Wan pointed to the outside of the jungle and looked at the old woman eagerly, meaning that she wanted to know when she could leave here. The old woman looked at her sympathetically, but shook her head. There were only 2 ways to go after being caught and brought to such a place. Either she had to take care of these people all year round like she did, or she had to die. There was no way she would be let go. It didn't take long for the old woman to leave the room. Jean Wan sat inside and waited until the old woman was far away, before she got up and moved her wrist with some difficulty. The pain made her more aware of the situation she was facing now. She stood in front of the window and looked out. This was a camp made up of many wooden huts, grass huts and tents. It was in the deepest part of the forest, and was surrounded by greenery. It was not a small area, and her vision was blurry in the dark. She could not see the specific appearance of the huts, only their outlines. There was a fire in the middle of the clearing, and a circle of people surrounded it. They were holding wine and meat, eating, drinking, and laughing loudly. From time to time, they would cast sharp glances in her direction. It was as if the matter of throwing her onto the bed, to have a good taste of her in a keep's hut, had been officially put on their agenda. Jean Wan's heart grew colder and colder when she saw the guns on their waists. This was not a peaceful country at all. There would never be such a place in China, but this was Cambodia. In the next few years, many international rescues were related to the civil strife in Cambodia. Whether it was the Mekong River or the Tunnel Sap Lake, there had been countless accidents. 10 years ago, the security here was even worse than 10 years later, and the peacekeeping situation here was not as good as it would be 10 years later. If she wanted to leave, she could only save herself. Outside the dense forest, Fong Ling changed into a tight-fitting black outfit, with 2 silencer guns on her waist. She was squatting down to tie her shoelaces, and at the same time, she put the dagger shining with cold light into the sheath next to her boots. "What are you doing?" Just as she was about to tie her shoelaces and get up, suddenly, a dark shadow appeared in front of her, and a pair of black leather boots stopped in front of her. She didn't need to look to know it was Nanheng's voice. Fong Ling didn't look up. She fixed the dagger by her boots, touched the gun at her waist, stood up, and looked expressionlessly at the cold man in front of her. "Jean Wan has been taken away for a day and a night. I have to go in to find her." Chapter 290. Fong Ling's eyes were cold. "She was caught when she was with me. Whether from Mr. Mo's point of view, or from the point of view of me as her bodyguard, the responsibility is on me. Even if I'm smashed to pieces, I must bring her back safely. I'm afraid that you won't be able to find her even if you're blown up," Nanheng scolded. "Mr. Mo has the secrets of the arms dealers. Those people have been afraid of the pressure Mr. Mo exerted on them, so they don't dare to do anything to him. But Jean Wan is different. She doesn't know those people and doesn't know how bloodthirsty they are. It's normal for them to kill people without blinking, not to mention that she is pregnant. It's because she is pregnant. With Jean Wan's IQ, she should be able to see the pros and cons of this place. If she has a child, she will better protect herself. If you rush in now, you'll just be hitting a stone with an egg," Nanheng said coldly. "I know you are more anxious than anyone else because of Jean Wan's accident. You two have developed a very good relationship after getting along with each other for so long. But Fong Ling, remember, You are a member of 11 Combat Base. Have you forgotten the rules of the base? Feng Ling looked at him coldly and said nothing. Don't be impulsive. That's the first rule. Nan Heng abruptly kicked her calf. When Feng Ling was about to dodge, he reached out and snatched the 2 guns from her waist. He spun them in his hand and then put the guns into his own waist. You! Feng Ling glared at him. Just stay here and wait. If it weren't for the minefield in this jungle, I would have gone in long ago. Why are you so anxious here? Nan Heng said expressionlessly. I've informed the Domestic Border Rescue Team and the SWAT team in the United States, who used to be on good terms with Mo Jingshan. They'll be here soon with a helicopter. Just wait patiently, Ann. We also have helicopters. I can drive him myself. Feng Ling frowned. Bullshit. Nan Heng directly scolded her. How many years has it been since the people inside fought against our base? Why haven't they been wiped out? Now that they have the ability to ambush Mo Jingshan, it is enough to show that they have set up layers of ambushes here, just waiting for the people from our base to enter. If you fly in now, before you can land on the airdrop to rescue him, you will be shot down by the people below. After so many missions, you have always been the calmest and most cautious. This time you can't calm down? Feng Ling pursed her lips and frowned. If you can't calm down, go back to High City and wait for news. You're not needed here. Nan Heng scolded coldly again. After confiscating her gun, he ignored her and turned to leave. Looking at his cold and tall back, Feng Ling suddenly took a step forward and reached out to snatch the gun back. But Nan Heng pressed her hand on his shoulder and threw her up. Feng Ling kept attacking him fiercely, but Nan Heng just looked at her coldly and expressionlessly, raised his hand to block, and only defended. In the end, he clasped her wrist and suddenly pulled the short-haired woman into his arms. Seeing this, Feng Ling immediately began to struggle in his arms, and Nan Heng lowered his head and bit her hard on the neck. You're the one who's going to die. Let me go. Feng Ling trembled in pain and shouted hoarsely. Hearing the noise here, Kay and the brothers in the base came over to see if there was anything wrong, but they immediately saw this scene. Shit! The 2 brothers decisively covered their eyes with their hands, and then peeped out a little. The corner of Kay's mouth also twitched. What was going on? What was going on with Boss and Feng Ling? Seeing someone coming over, Feng Ling suddenly stepped on Nan Heng's foot fiercely, bent her leg back, and kicked at his leg bone. Nan Heng released her in time and dodged her attack with his leg. Feng Ling raised her hand and rubbed it hard on her neck, glanced at him coldly, and then turned to look at Kay and the others, saying coldly, What are you looking at? Kay coughed, saw the bite mark on Feng Ling's neck, and was about to leave with the other 2 brothers, when Feng Ling suddenly said because they seemed to understand something. Just now a snake came over and I was bitten. Boss just came to help me suck the poison out, so it's not what you saw. It would have been better if she hadn't explained, but as soon as she did, Kay and the others immediately fled faster. Damn! With Feng Ling's ability, let alone being bitten by a snake, even if she was bitten, how could a snake have climbed to her neck without being discovered? And it could even bite her neck. What kind of snake could do that? Seeing them running fast, Feng Ling turned to look at Nan Heng with a livid face. But Nan Heng put one hand in his black trouser pocket, and the other hand played with the silencer he had taken from her, raising his eyebrows at her very unkindly. Feng Ling closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and suddenly reached out. Give me back the gun. Nan Heng sneered. Speaking of being bitten by a snake, when you were on a mission in the United States, you were really bitten by a poisonous snake in the jungle. Do you still remember how I sucked the poison out for you? Feng Ling kept a straight face and said nothing. If it hadn't been for that incident, he wouldn't have found out that she was a woman. She gave up the gun in his hand, turned to leave, and then pulled out the dagger at her feet, threw it behind her fiercely, deeply stabbed it into the ground, and walked away quickly with no expression on her face. Nan Heng glanced at the dagger accurately inserted into the ground at his feet, snorted, picked up the dagger, and followed her. Jinwan didn't sleep well, and was startled in her sleep. She turned over and felt an inexplicable chill on her back. She opened her eyes with a jerk, only to see a black muzzle pointed at her head. Jinwan didn't know what was going on. She didn't know what was going on. She was startled, and at the same time, her face immediately changed into a more obvious panic, and she hurriedly sat up. The muzzle had been pointed at her. She shrank in the corner of the wooden bed, hugged her legs tightly, and looked up at the owner of the gun who was holding it. Akib's finger pulled the trigger, looked at her coldly, and asked in English, "Tell me, who on earth sent you to lurk here? Do you think you can escape by deliberately spilling the soup? Ha, what a joke, thinking that you're smart." With that, the cold muzzle was directly pressed against her forehead. As long as his thumb gently pressed, Jinwan's head would be pierced by the bullet in an instant. Chapter 291. Akib was about to pull the trigger, but Jinwan saw that there was no one else in the cabin, not even the old woman who had been protecting her. She thought she might really die this time, but fortunately, she didn't implicate Mo Jingshan. She felt a chill in her heart and slowly closed her eyes, but the sweat overflowing from her nose clearly showed her fear and nervousness, which was not the instinctive reaction of a well-trained informant or base personnel. Akib glanced at her hesitantly again, but he still couldn't let this kind of person live. He was about to kill her, when suddenly Dolly ran in from outside. Dolly didn't know what he said, but it sounded like he was in a hurry. Akib paused, withdrew his eyes from Dolly, looked at Jinwan coldly, and said in English, "Control is our distinguished guest. He hasn't eaten or drunk anything for 4 days. No matter how strong his mind and body are, he can't hold on. Now he has collapsed and will die at any time." Jinwan still looked at him blankly, as if she couldn't hear anything. Seeing that she was still scared out of her wits, Akib suddenly put away the gun impatiently, turned back, said a few words to Dolly in Cambodian and left. Jinwan's heart was beating like a drum. She didn't expect that she would escape death. And the reason why she escaped death was that Mo Jingshan hadn't eaten or drunk anything for 4 days. He had fallen down to distract Akib's attention from her. Akib said that Mo Jingshan had collapsed. What did that mean? Did he faint or did something happen to him? Jinwan didn't dare to show her worry on her face. She just looked at Dolly standing in the room with fear. Dolly signaled her with his eyes to get out of bed and follow him. Jinwan bit her lower lip and pointed to her hand, which was still wrapped in gauze, meaning that she could no longer deliver food or do anything in her current state. Dolly impatiently kicked the wooden bed under her. Knowing that she was mute and couldn't hear anything, he muttered a few curses and impatiently urged her to go with him. Jinwan could only get off the bed with a timid expression. She shrunk her neck and followed behind him, as though she was afraid of death. Dolly took her to the surrounded cabin, where Mo Jingshan was. Jinwan was a little worried that they would continue to carry out the order Akib had given her last night. She was thinking about how to avoid this deadlock. Suddenly, Akib signaled her with his eyes to go to the stone table over there and put the bowl of water in. Jinwan looked at him in confusion. Akib pointed at the water, and then at the cabin where Mo Jingshan lived. His meaning was obvious. He wanted her to go in and deliver the water. Not delivering food but water instead? What does that mean? The door of the cabin was open. She remembered that Mo Jingshan's body did not show any signs of being tied up, but he did not come out. Could he have really fainted? Jinwan slowly moved to the door of the cabin and looked in. She saw Mo Jingshan, who had always been tall and straight, sitting against the wooden wall by the window of the cabin. His eyes were closed, his face was pale, and his lips were a little cracked and white. Obviously, he was seriously dehydrated and was in a semi-coma. He did not lie down, but insisted on sitting there, closing his eyes to rest. It turned out that their purpose was to let her go in and feed him water. Jinwan glanced at him, and then turned her eyes to the bowl of water on the rough stone table outside. She walked over and, under Dolly's cold stare, picked up the bowl of water. She didn't know if Mo Jingshan had been refusing to eat their food and water because he was worried that they would poison him, or if he was just resisting. But now she was even more uncertain whether there was poison in the bowl of water. As Jinwan walked to the cabin with the bowl in her hands, she suddenly spilled some of the water in the bowl on the back of her hand that had been scalded last night. It hurt so much that she dropped the bowl, and the whole bowl of water spilled out in an instant. Seeing her clumsy appearance, Dolly was about to kick her, and even wanted to take out a gun and shoot her. But he remembered that Akib had told him that control had completely refused everyone here. But this woman was not one of them. Moreover, women were more careful than men like them. Now she was asked to take care of control, find a way to feed him water, make him eat, and keep him alive. That was the right thing to do. Otherwise, if control really died like this, they would lose the trump card in their hands that could threaten 11 Base and the American police, let alone the fact that they hadn't got those secrets yet. He had to be kept alive. Dolly suppressed his temper, cursed, and asked Jinwan to fetch another bowl of water. Jinwan got up shakily, nodded at him, and then trotted to the man-made well near the cooking tent, got a bowl of clean water, and carefully brought it over. Dolly glared at her, warned her not to dawdle, and told her to go in and feed him the water. But after she went in, Dolly and several people guarded the door and the window, staring at the situation inside, and watching Jinwan and Mo Jingshan's expressions. They would not miss any suspicious clues. Jinwan walked in, and quickly came up to Mo Jingshan. She tried to make her raised hand tremble a little, but her trembling would not be regarded as excitement or nervousness. They would only think that she was afraid. She carefully brought the water to Mo Jingshan's slightly parched lips. Even though the man had not eaten, drank, washed, or slept for 4 days and his breathing was much thinner than usual, when his breath brushed against her hand, it was still warm, clear, and uniquely Mo Jingshan's scent. Jinwan raised the bowl and tried to feed him the water, but the man's lips were closed. Although he didn't close them tightly, she couldn't feed him. She couldn't speak, so she could only pat him gently on the shoulder with her hand. Mo Jingshan frowned and didn't open his eyes. Feeling the bowl of water near his mouth, he turned his head away. Jinwan was really anxious this time. She pressed the bowl hard against his mouth and patted him on the shoulder. But it was useless, so she had to raise her hand and pat him on the face. If it were any other time, Mo Jingshan would definitely smell the familiar scent on her body. He would definitely know who she was. But after 4 or 5 consecutive days of suffering, even if his sense of smell hadn't failed, he would not be so sensitive in his current state of dehydration and weakness. Seeing that he still didn't open his eyes or mouth, Jinwan simply pressed his outstretched leg down and sat on his knee. Chapter 292. The moment their eyes met, Jinwan stared at him, and then pointed to the water in the bowl with her finger. All of Mo Jingshan's senses seemed to slowly recover at this moment. He smelled a long-lost fragrance coming from Jinwan's body. It was similar to the cold fragrance after taking a shower in the morning. It was fresh and sweet, with the calming smell of dawn in High City, and the unique fragrance of long dew flowers in this place. The people outside the room were staring at their expressions. Jinwan didn't speak, but signaled him to drink the water quickly with her eyes. Mo Jingshan didn't move, nor did he take the bowl of water. His cold gaze made her shudder. Even though Jinwan knew that it was impossible for him to show any intimacy or friendliness to her at this time, she was still frozen by his eyes. Just as she was about to force the water into his mouth, the man slowly closed his eyes once more, using the method of isolating himself from her gaze and refusing to meet her eyes again. Jinwan was anxious again. She sat on his lap and patted him hard on the shoulder with her other hand. Damn it, why couldn't she pretend to be a mute? Now she couldn't speak. She was so anxious. The man didn't even move his eyebrows. He just sat there silently, saying nothing and not opening his eyes. He seemed to treat the people here the same way he treated them, still so distant. Jinwan's hand was scalded, so she couldn't pinch him hard. She could only keep patting his shoulder in vain until the man frowned, because of her constant harassment. When he opened his eyes again, Jinwan raised her scalded hand and waved it in front of his eyes. Mo Jingshan, you fool, I'm trapped here with you. I've tortured myself like this, but I'm still trying to survive. Your life is so important. You can't die. Jinwan couldn't speak and could only look at him, glaring at him. Mo Jingshan saw the white cloth wrapped around her hand and the burn marks on the unbandaged area outside the white cloth. The punctured blisters were infected by the ash of those useless herbs. After one night, they had become red and swollen, and a thin layer of skin had been festered. It could be seen that they were seriously scalded. Mo Jingshan's gaze slowly moved away from her hand. Jinwan stared at him with reddened eyes. Her gaze gradually turned pleading as she begged him to drink some water. However, the man only looked at her like this for a moment before closing his eyes again. His attitude was still as cold as ever. Seeing that she hadn't even fed him a mouthful of water, Dolly stood in front of the door and looked at her sharply, reaching for the gun at his waist. There was no need to keep such a good-for-nothing. Out of the corner of her eye, Jinwan saw Dolly touch the gun, and her heart beat wildly. Looking at Mo Jingshan's pale lips, she suddenly raised the bowl, drank a mouthful of water, leaned down, and threw herself on him. Before the man could react, she pressed her lips against his closed lips and poured all the water into his mouth. The man frowned at her sudden movement and opened his eyes abruptly. His deep, dark eyes met hers, which were still bright even though they were close at hand. Jinwan stuck out her tongue, opened his teeth, and licked his mouth in a way that Dolly and the people in front of the window couldn't see, as if she were licking him or deliberately punishing him. He instantly darkened his eyes and stared at her. Jinwan quickly stepped back, looking as if she had no choice but to feed him in this way to survive. She lowered her head, took another mouthful of water, and threw herself on him again, pouring water into his mouth. This time the man didn't force his mouth to close. When her tongue seemed to unconsciously reach in, the man felt the softness of her lips and quietly sucked it. Jinwan shuddered and stared at him. They both knew each other's meaning. Even though Jinwan understood why he had been so cold, at this moment, she still felt a sour feeling in her heart. If she continued to feed him with her mouth, it would be too deliberate. She was thinking about what to do when suddenly, the man's deep eyes turned cold. When Dolly came in and was about to take a closer look, he pushed Jinwan mercilessly and pushed her out of his arms with great force. Jinwan was caught off guard and suddenly fell back to the ground. Jinwan reacted quickly. She immediately looked in horror at Dolly, who was approaching with cold eyes. She hurriedly picked up the bowl that had been spilled on the ground, stood up in a panic, and silently pointed to the water stain on the corner of Mo Jingshan's mouth, indicating that she had completed her task and begged Dolly not to kill her. Dolly gave her a cold look and tilted his head, indicating for her to go out. Jinwan nodded quickly, turned around and ran out. Dolly didn't miss any expression on her face. It was not until she went out that he turned his eyes back to Mo Jingshan. "Mr. Control, you are really a man of extraordinary perseverance, but as long as we don't want you to die, you won't die. When you really pass out, we'll put something into your mouth even if we have to, just like that mute woman just now. I think you enjoy it very much. Why don't you let her feed you in this way for the next meal?" Mo Jingshan coldly curved his lips. The water stain on his lips had dried. His lips were still a little cracked and pale, but he didn't lose his cool demeanor. He indifferently looked at Dolly's smug eyes. "I'll be disgusted to death by you before I starve to death." The man spat out a cold and even disgusted English sentence. Dolly raised his eyebrows. Disgusted? Although the woman just now was mute, she was good-looking. How was she disgusted? Our people are all ready to make a meal of her in a few days. Don't you like Asian beauties? Looks like we should catch some Western beauties to please you. For the next 2 days, you should feel wronged. Let this Asian woman bring you food. That's right. Mo Jingshan's eyes became colder. You can get out of here. Dolly snorted. It's been 4 days. How long do you think you can hold on? Mo Jingshan didn't even lift his eyelids and said indifferently, "Don't let those disgusting women in again." "Oh, do you hate women so much?" Dolly smiled coldly. "Unfortunately, from now on, the task of delivering food and water to you will be handed over to that person just now. If you still don't eat or drink, I can shoot a useless piece of trash like her." With that, Dolly played with the gun in his hand, turned it around on his fingertips, and then sneered at Mo Jingshan's expression. Chapter 293. In the evening, she still couldn't avoid the meal. This time, Jinwan couldn't avoid it by burning her hand. Akib asked Dolly to follow her from morning to night, and the only thing Jinwan could do was to observe Dolly's habits. Dolly drank some wine at lunch and dinner every day, but he didn't drink too much, take a nap, or get drunk, and give others any chance to escape. He was such a cautious and self-disciplined person. No wonder Akib trusted him so much. The old woman had retreated the gauze on Jinwan's hand, but it was still not a professional way. The burn on the back of Jinwan's hand was mixed with the color of herbal ash, which looked even more terrible. Fortunately, it was wrapped in white gauze, or she couldn't bear to look at it. As soon as Jinwan appeared in Mo Jingshan's cabin, she saw the man who had been sitting by the wall during the day was now standing in front of the window, leaning against the wooden windowsill, coldly glancing at her who had just walked in. He could still stand up. It seemed that the water she forced into him in the morning had worked. At least he was not completely dehydrated. Dolly and the group of people stood outside as usual watching. Jinwan silently carried the wooden tray in, took out the 2 bowls inside, and then looked at Mo Jingshan, telling him to eat with her eyes. Mo Jingshan stood there motionlessly, just looking at her. There was a light black in his eyes, cold and bright. When Dolly stared at Jinwan, Mo Jingshan's eyes were deep and dark with a dangerous warning. Jinwan understood. He told her to behave, not to try to save him here, and not to make any suspicious movements. He was telling her to protect herself first. Jinwan calmly looked at the food on the table, picked up the chopsticks and bowls, and walked up to him. Mo Jingshan looked at her and didn't move. Jinwan thought that if she hadn't been caught here, she might have been able to stay with Feng Ling and Nan Heng and wait for the best time to rescue him. Now, since she was already eating, she was completely on the same rope as him. Her first priority was not to protect herself, but to let him eat. She had persisted for 4 days. If she didn't eat or drink anymore, her child would have no father. As Jinwan approached with the bowl, Mo Jingshan's gaze grew colder and colder. Jinwan knew that the 2 of them were facing a dead end. It was his fault whether he ate the food or not, but if he was forced to eat it, at least he could be forgiven. After all, Mo Jingshan's strength should be no match for hers. If she really wanted to force him to eat it, he couldn't stop her. Dolly didn't think it was strange. She scooped a mouthful of rice with her chopsticks and placed it by his mouth. The man was still the same as when he drank water in the morning. He pursed his lips and stood there silently. Jinwan tried hard to make a few more gestures at him. In fact, she was making gestures for Dolly to see. She was telling him that if he didn't eat, she would be killed. Then she put her palms together and begged him to eat. Dolly didn't know what to say. Instead, she put her palms together and begged him to eat. Mo Jingshan looked at her coldly and suddenly sneered. He took a chair in the cabin and sat down. After sitting down, he still didn't say a word. It was as if an extreme mime was being performed in this large room. It was silent, but there were countless hidden sharpness. If the acting wasn't done well, the show would be ruined, and the actors would die. Jinwan took a mouthful of rice and chewed it in her mouth. Then she opened her mouth and made an ah sound like a mute, as though telling him that the rice was very clean, that she had made it herself, and that it was not poisonous. Mo Jingshan sat down on the wooden chair, raised his hand, and was about to knock over another bowl on the table next to him, when he was suddenly held back by a very weak force. He turned his head and saw that Jinwan's burned hand had tightly grasped the corner of his clothes. His gaze coldly moved up and looked at her. Jinwan moved her lips and carefully protected the bowl so that it wouldn't be knocked over by him. Seeing the stalemate, she heard Dolly and the group of people outside talking and laughing in Cambodian, and from time to time, she could hear some sarcastic laughter. They had guns in their hands, and they had the power of life and death here. They could watch from outside, as if they were watching a show. But Jinwan and Mo Jingshan had to put their lives on the line here. If they were not careful, they would be doomed eternally. How could she play this scene to the fullest? How could she reasonably force a man to be soft-hearted so that he could eat? Jinwan suddenly put down the bowl in her hand and slowly knelt down under Mo Jingshan's indifferent expression. Mo Jingshan sat on the chair and watched her suddenly kneel down. His calm black eyes flickered, but only for a moment. He still looked at her expressionlessly, but his hand was holding the armrest of the chair at an angle that no one could see. His slender fingers clenched tighter and tighter, and his knuckles turned white, but there was no change in his expression. Jinwan cried, begged, and knelt down. Dolly was enjoying himself outside, Seeing that Emo Jingshan didn't show any intention of eating, it seemed that this woman who was caught had nothing to do with him. She might not even be a Chinese. After all, if she was his compatriot, he might have some sympathy. It seemed that Emo Jingshan was not only strong-willed, but also ruthless. He couldn't even move such a beautiful and pitiful woman. Seeing that he was still unmoved, Dolly simply walked in and put the gun directly on Jinwan's head. Jinwan knelt on the ground and didn't dare to move. Dolly pointed the gun at Jinwan's forehead and said in English with a sneer, "Mr. Control, are you really not going to eat? It seems that this woman is really useless. Since you hate her so much, I'll kill her in front of you. What do you think?" Emo Jingshan smiled faintly, looked at him coldly, and said in an indifferent tone, "Really?" Dolly pressed the trigger, glanced at Emo Jingshan's indifferent expression, and asked him, "Do you want to kill her or not?" Emo Jingshan lowered his eyes and didn't look at Jinwan again. He looked cold and expressionless. "Then kill her." Hearing this, Dolly narrowed his eyes. Jinwan knelt stiffly on the ground, and the black muzzle was pointed at her forehead. She didn't move, nor did Dolly, and the man sitting on the wooden chair didn't even lift his eyelids. There was a dead silence in the room for a few seconds. Suddenly, the corners of Dolly's mouth curved, and he chuckled in a low voice. He suddenly withdrew the gun and put it back to his waist. "Mr. Control, you really don't know how to be tender to women. Even such a fair and beautiful woman can't move you." Chapter 294. Emo Jingshan looked at this scene, his eyes calm. Dolly smiled again and let go of Jinwan's chin. It was not until she was taken out of the house by the people outside that Jinwan realized that she seemed to have dodged another bullet. It seemed that in this kind of place, it was not only about IQ, but also about who was more stable. No wonder Feng Ling said that Emo Jingshan once only needed one decision to make these people lose billions of dollars. Judging from Emo Jingshan's ability to figure out all the thoughts of the enemy, and even accurately grasp all the psychological activities and changes of the enemy, Dolly had clearly lost in front of him. Emo Jingshan had long seen through their plan. Jinwan was just trying her best to cooperate with them. But it was Emo Jingshan who really controlled the overall situation. He was too relaxed all the time. As a result, Jinwan calmed down a lot. She believed that as long as she lived one more hour or one more day, there would be a greater chance for them to get out of here alive. Just like this, Jinwan spent another night peacefully, but this night was particularly long. On the first night here, she was really more afraid than calm. After all, as a person living in the peaceful world of High City, she had never had such an experience of her fate being controlled by others at any time. It was no exaggeration to say that she lived in a place where blood flowed from the edge of a knife. Tonight, she was a little more relaxed because she knew that everything should be under Emo Jingshan's control. Time passed slowly and torturously. The kerosene lamp in the cabin had burned out. Jinwan sat in the cabin in a daze, then lay on the bed and carefully tossed and turned. The old woman was a light sleeper because of her old age, and the slightest movement would wake her up, so Jinwan moved very gently. In the dead of night, the people on duty in the camp were sitting on the ground to take a nap, but each of them was holding a gun in their hand. Jinwan suddenly wanted to go to the bathroom. For the past 2 days, the old woman had accompanied her to the jungle to find a safe place, and there were people guarding not far away, which was very embarrassing. Now the old woman was asleep. Jinwan carefully got up from the wooden bed and tiptoed out of the cabin. Seeing the 2 people on duty outside the cabin leaning against the trunk and sleeping soundly, Jinwan held her breath and went all the way out. It took her more than 10 minutes to find a suitable place to go to the bathroom, and she almost got lost. In the meantime, she had also successfully evaded the sight of the other 2 patrolling soldiers in the camp. The forest outside was dense, and the leaves and branches covered the sky. The lush greenery blocked out most of the moonlight, and the sounds of insects and birds could be heard in the hot and stuffy air. When Jinwan was about to go back, she stopped after walking more than 10 meters. Ever since she was captured and brought here, she had never come out alone. Even though this place was not far from the barracks, she finally had a taste of freedom. She turned around and walked forward aimlessly. Although it was possible for her to escape now, Jingxian was still here. She couldn't leave on her own. Suddenly, she felt a tingling pain on her calf. She thought she was bitten by a snake that often roamed in the forest. She looked down and found that she had accidentally tripped on a thorn. Fortunately, it wasn't a snake. Jinwan did not stop. She endured the pain and continued walking. When she was further away from the camp, she suddenly noticed that the grass in front of her seemed to have been turned over. The ground was not as dense as it seemed. Her footsteps faltered. Could this be the minefield they were talking about? However, at this moment, Jinwan seemed to hear a strange noise in the distance. It was a bit like the sound of helicopter propellers that she had seen on TV before, gradually approaching. A helicopter? Was it Feng Ling and Nanheng? Jinwan's eyes lit up, and she raised her head abruptly. But the leaves in the dense forest were too dense to see anything. But if she could hear the sound of the helicopter, the patrolling soldiers in the camp must have heard it too. She was not sure what was going on inside. Those people should not be able to find her for the time being. But Jingxian was still there. Without thinking, Jinwan abruptly turned around and walked straight back. As soon as she returned to the vicinity of the camp, she clearly sensed that all the patrolling and watchmen had already stood up. The security of the entire camp was even tighter than during the day, and the number of patrolling and sentries had suddenly increased by a lot. When Jinwan returned, the old woman happened to come out in a hurry to find her. Seeing her come back, she asked her a lot of questions. Jinwan innocently pointed to the place where the old woman had taken her to go to the bathroom. The old woman remembered that she drank a lot of water before going to bed at night, and understood. She took her back to the cabin quickly, so that she wouldn't be affected by those people outside. That night, the camp was already in a state of panic. After the sound of the helicopter rang out once, it suddenly disappeared. An hour later, the sound of the helicopter suddenly approached again. Just as everyone was on guard and prepared for the airdrop, the sound disappeared again. Everyone in the camp did not sleep until dawn. They were on high alert, but they did not see a single helicopter come in even though they had been on guard all night. Akib was a very cunning and cautious man. His men were all big and tough, and without exception, they were all ruthless. But even if they were ruthless, they were all human beings and had to rest. Akib and his men knew that the people outside must be deliberately interrupting their rest again and again, not giving them time to recuperate, and every time they took off, they would scout the situation in the dense forest. But in this case, they had to endure it. These people were all in good physical condition, and they wouldn't be affected too much even if they didn't sleep for a night. But after being played like this again and again, it was inevitable that some people would be dissatisfied. After being played by the helicopter several times, when they heard the sound again, a small number of people simply didn't move at all and continued to sit there with their eyes closed to rest. However, this operation involved new and old grievances with 11 Base, and with Jingxian's help, even though they were already angry, they didn't dare to take it lightly. Jinwan got up in the morning and continued to deliver food to them with the old woman. When they were eating, she walked to the back with the old woman. Dolly didn't follow her this time. What happened to Jingxian yesterday was enough to make Dolly temporarily relieved. Taking advantage of this opportunity to deliver food to Jingxian as usual, Jinwan walked alone to the cabin in the depths of the camp. Chapter 295. The moment she entered the door, the figure in the black shirt on the wooden chair didn't move. As she hurriedly approached, he opened his eyes. His deep black eyes fell on her face. Without Dolly's supervision, Jinwan hurriedly ran up to Jingxian, handed him the water in the tray, and whispered, "Feng Ling and Nanheng will be here soon. There will be a war here. Those people have been harassed by the sound of the helicopter. No one can see them now. You need strength. Drink some water." Jinwan hadn't said a word for more than 2 days. Her voice was a little hoarse, but he could hear her clearly. Jingxian lowered his eyes and looked at Jinwan's hand, which was still wrapped in white cloth. At this time, he had no time to ask her why she came to Cambodia and why she was caught here. When he saw her fingers were redder and swollen than yesterday, A cold look flashed across his face. At the same time, Mo Jingshan's eyes turned cold and he said in a low voice, "Someone is coming." Jin Wan, who was about to feed him water, suddenly paused, took a step back, held the bowl with both hands, and continued to stand there timidly as if asking him to eat. Hearing that Jin Wan came to deliver food early in the morning as he asked, Dolly took the time to come over and take a look. Outside the door, he saw Jin Wan trembling in fear, and then glanced at Mo Jingshan. Mo Jingshan sat there without a trace of expression on his face. The water and food in the bowl were still untouched. There was no time to keep an eye on this woman today. After saying a few words to the people outside the wooden house, Dolly turned back to Akib with a cold face. But at this time, the people outside had already fixed their eyes on them. Jin Wan calmly looked up at Mo Jingshan. The sound of the helicopter was getting closer and closer. It had never been so close last night. The camp was in a mess. Seeing Jin Wan standing in the room without speaking or moving, and Mo Jingshan's face was cold. The men outside the room saw Jin Wan standing in the room without speaking or moving, and Mo Jingshan's face was cold. After watching for a while, they took their guns to go to the front to see what was going on, leaving only 2 men outside. But they also looked inside for a long time and couldn't see anything, so they didn't pay special attention to the movements inside. Jin Wan stared at Mo Jingshan. When she saw the man nod silently, she abruptly pushed open the door and ran out, screaming in a panic. As she ran, she pointed at the roar of the approaching helicopters in the sky as if she were frightened. The 2 men guarding outside saw her desperately running out. In this situation, anyone who had nothing to do with their gang was very suspicious. Seeing that she ran, the 2 men simply raised their guns and aimed in her direction, planning to kill her directly to avoid future trouble. Just as the 2 of them focused on aiming at Jin Wan, they didn't notice the man coming out of the wooden house behind them, nor did they notice that the man was holding 2 hard stone bowls in his hands. The bowls immediately hit the most vulnerable part of their necks. When the 2 of them came to their senses and were about to raise their guns back, it was too late. Because of the dull pain in the back of their necks and the momentary numbness in their heads, their movements slowed down a lot. In the blink of an eye, the 2 guns were snatched away by the man. Then he bent his arm and hit their eyes and abdomen hard with his elbow. The 2 of them had no time to resist and were pressed to the ground. The 2 of them lay on the ground, shouting a lot of words, but they couldn't raise their voices, so they couldn't call for help from the people in front of the camp. They didn't expect that this person who hadn't eaten for 4 or 5 days still had strength. Jin Wan didn't run far. If she ran too far and was found by the people in front, she would only alert the enemy. Noticing Mo Jingshan's situation, she suddenly turned and ran back. Fortunately, she had specially taken 2 polished stone bowls from the cooking tent today. The bowls used here were all rough wood bowls and stone bowls. When Dolly was watching her, she had always taken the safe wooden bowls. Today, when Dolly was not with them and the old woman was not paying attention, she secretly took the stone bowls. It turned out that they really came in handy. As soon as she rushed back, she saw Mo Jingshan put the guns on the heads of the 2 men. The man's black shirt was a little wrinkled, and his hair was slightly messy. He hadn't taken care of his appearance for many days. His stubble was faintly visible, but his eyes were as sharp as blades, dark and piercingly cold. Jin Wan hadn't seen Mo Jingshan holding a gun, but in this environment full of desperados, whoever had a gun could protect himself. She paused, abruptly picked up 2 palm-sized stones on the ground, ran over, and smashed them hard on the heads of the 2 men. Seeing that they were knocked unconscious, she let out a long breath. When she raised her eyes again, she saw Mo Jingshan raise his eyes. He didn't speak, but just stared at her. "I think they just fainted," Jin Wan said with some uncertainty. She hadn't killed anyone, but these 2 stones should be very powerful. Not to mention they were hit on the head. Even if they didn't die, they should be disabled. Mo Jingshan withdrew his gaze. Seeing that the 2 men were really motionless, he stood up. But when he walked out of the cabin, the strength he had accumulated for a long time could only last for a while. After all, he hadn't eaten for 4 or 5 days, so he staggered when he got up. Jin Wan quickly stepped forward to grab his arm and help him up. The man slowly stood up, checked the remaining bullets in the 2 guns in his hands, and stuffed one of them into Jinwan's sleeve. Jinwan's white dress had no pockets, and only the wide sleeves could barely hold some things. "How are you?" Jinwan couldn't care about anything else, but stared at his pale face. But even though he hadn't eaten for several days, she could still feel the strength of the man's body as she held his arm. Mo Jingshan didn't answer, but just took a deep look at her. Listening to the roar that was getting closer and closer, he asked, "Why are you here?" The fear and grievance she had hidden in her heart for so many days almost burst out with his belated question. Jinwan held back her tears and glared at him resentfully. "You asked me to wait for you to come back. And you said you would take me back to High City, but you didn't go at all. Since you didn't go, I had to come to you." She said it easily. How could she come to a place like Cambodia so easily? Jinwan. The man looked at her seriously. Now he had no time to argue with her why she came to Cambodia, nor did he have time to ask her why she was caught here. He said seriously, "From now on, follow me closely. When Nan Hung and his men arrive, immediately leave with them. You must be obedient and can't be willful, understand?" Jinwan wanted to say that if she went with them, what would he do? Would he stay and deal with these fugitives? Chapter 296. This place could be bombarded by helicopters at any time. Mo Jingshan was about to take Jinwan to the dense forest behind. Hearing her words, he suddenly turned to look at her. Seeing that the man suddenly stared at her without saying a word, his long and deep gaze falling on her, she was afraid that he would think she was joking, so she raised her hand and grabbed his arm hard, saying clearly, "You didn't hear wrong, Mo Jingshan. I'm pregnant." The man stood in front of her without moving. Jinwan had wanted to use the pregnancy to make him feel a little better, but from his cold eyes, she could tell that he was not only not happy, but also wanted to scold her. She was pregnant, yet she still came to this kind of place. Indeed, she needed a lesson. Jinwan was very self-aware, and complained in her heart. Before he could speak, she suddenly stood on tiptoe and hugged his neck, pulling his body down. "Don't be angry. Even if I'm about to give birth, I won't be able to stay in High City and wait for you to come back. Mo Jingshan, if I'm in your shoes and I'm in danger, you'll definitely want to stand on the same land as me as soon as possible. Don't drive me away. Although I've been suffering a little humiliation here for the past 2 days, at least I survived and didn't get hurt. I won't die, and neither will you." Mo Jingshan's eyes were as dark as ink. He raised his hand to hold the woman in his arms who had vowed to stand on the same land as him, and his arms tightened. In this kind of environment, there was no obvious surprise or joy. There was only a silent embrace that hugged her very, very tightly. Finally in his arms, after days of hesitation and fear, she finally found her sense of belonging. "Since you're here, how can I drive you away?" The man's voice was low and husky by her ear. His light breath passed through her hair, and he kissed her temple. "But you must be obedient and listen to my arrangements at any time. Don't force yourself, do you hear me?" Jinwan nodded in his arms. Hearing the sound of the helicopter approaching, Mo Jingshan decisively took Jinwan's hand and dragged her into the dense forest behind the cabin. "Stand here and don't move. If there's a bombing, don't go out and run around. They won't bomb a large area. They will only throw things down in a small area to distract these people. Some of the smoke bombs contain smoke and dust, and it will dissipate in 10 minutes. Mo Jingshan brought Jinwan to a small puddle in the forest, and was about to take off his shirt. Jinwan immediately understood what he meant. She hurriedly pressed his hand down, and took off the white cloth wrapped around her hand. Anyway, it was useless to keep the white cloth wrapped around her hand. After taking it off, she turned around and dipped it in the puddle. Then, she folded it, and made a gesture of covering her mouth and nose. She then asked him, "Is that what you mean?" Mo Jingshan gave her a look of approval, but when he saw the severely burned skin on the back of her hand, he was silent for 2 seconds before saying, "Stand there and don't move. Wait for me to come back. Wait for me." These 4 words again. Jinwan subconsciously reached out and grabbed his wrist. "What are you going to do?" "I'll go with you. Don't you remember what I said just now?" Mo Jingshan turned to look at her. Listen to me at any time. Don't force yourself. Mo Jingshan, I'm already standing with you in such a dangerous place. Where else can I hide? Instead of letting me face the fear of not knowing how long I'll have to wait for you, why don't you let me follow you? The man looked out indifferently. Although this place wouldn't be affected by the things dropped by the helicopter, Jinwan might face unknown danger at any time. Not to mention that this place was not far from the minefield. Once the desperados in the camp fled in this direction, they would soon find her. In this dense forest, there was no absolutely safe place. Whether she went with him or stayed alone, she might face unknown danger at any time. After hesitating for only 2 seconds, the man took her wrist and led her out. Jinwan relaxed. She held the cloth that had just been soaked in the puddle in one hand, and held his hand with the other. The camp was now ready to go. Akib and Dali were calmly arranging every mission. From the beginning, they laid an ambush layer by layer here, to suddenly being surrounded by so many helicopters. It only took a blink of an eye. Although measures had been laid to prevent helicopters from coming in and besieging them, they didn't expect that there would be so many helicopters. Nor did they expect that the American police would come to support them. They really underestimated Mo Jingshan's influence in the eyes of those Americans. If there were only those people from 11 Base, they could try their best. But now so many helicopters had come prepared, and his men hadn't had a rest since last night. Their odds of winning had dropped from 100% to less than 50%. Jinwan and Mo Jingshan were outside their patrol area. She had been standing behind him, so she could only quietly poke her head out to look over there. She was more worried about Mo Jingshan's physical strength. How long could he hold on? Although there were many helicopters, they couldn't land immediately. During this period of waiting, the two of them were in the most dangerous situation. The cabin where Mo Jingshan lived had been searched by them. They couldn't go back, or they would be killed. Just as the two of them moved to the back of another cabin, suddenly, Mo Jingshan looked through the window of the cabin in front of him, and saw that one of the patrolling men had found them, and was quietly loading a gun. He pulled Jinwan, and pushed her into the gap behind the haystack on the side of the cabin. Lie down. Don't make a sound. Mo Jingshan quickly pressed the haystack on Jinwan, and held the gun at his waist, keeping an inconspicuous distance from the haystack, where Jinwan was hiding as fast as possible. But in an instant, the man on the opposite side had come around from the side, raised his gun, and aimed at Mo Jingshan. The other patrolling men didn't notice this direction. Only this man raised the long gun in his hand, and aimed at him, as if to claim credit. Mo Jingshan looked at him calmly. The man's gun was obviously much more powerful than the one in his hand. The man looked at him and smiled, surprised to see Mo Jingshan standing here alone. He asked in English, "Mr. Control, do you really think we dare not kill you? Now we have been surrounded by your men. You are no longer a threatening trump card in our hands. I can kill you at any time." Chapter 297. The man suddenly looked around, and finally fixed his eyes on the tall haystack in the corner of the cabin, and the gap behind it that could accommodate a person. Mo Jingshan paused because of the man's gaze. He suddenly took the gun from his waist, threw it to the ground, and raised one hand above his head. The man's attention immediately returned to Mo Jingshan. Seeing him throw the gun away, he immediately smiled. But Mo Jingshan had always been dangerous, and they all knew how unfathomable he was. Even so, they didn't dare to approach him, but just pointed the gun at his head. As long as he dared to move, they could shoot him at any time. At this moment, another man patrolling the cabin noticed the movement here. When he came over, he saw this scene, and exchanged a look with the previous man. The two of them stood there with guns at the same time. Jinwan lay in the haystack, looking at the scene a few meters away with a pale face. But Mo Jingshan stood there calmly, and didn't even look in her direction. Although these desperados were loyal to Akib, they were still desperados. They would try their best to gain the most benefits for themselves, so they were now considering whether to kill Mo Jingshan, or bring him to Akib to claim credit for it. Mo Jingshan knew what they were thinking, but he didn't move. Besides, Jinwan was in the haystack not far away. No matter how careful the plan was, It couldn't be more important than her safety and her words. "Mo Jingshan, I'm pregnant." At this moment he couldn't afford to gamble. Suddenly, the man who came later found a corner of the white dress under the haystack. The white dress was given to her by the old woman. It didn't fit her very well, and was very long. No matter how hard she tried to hide, the color of the white dress couldn't be hidden too well in the haystack, and there would always be a touch of white that caught their attention. The man narrowed his eyes and pointed the gun at the haystack. Mo Jingshan's temples were throbbing. These people were extremely vicious. If they pointed their guns at him, he could at least fight for a chance of survival. But when it came to Jinwan, he was in danger of shooting at any time. Just as he was about to shoot, Mo Jingshan abruptly moved his feet. The gun that had been thrown to the ground was instantly hooked up and returned to his hands. Seeing that he was about to shoot, the man who came first, not deciding whether to kill him or exchange him for benefits, abruptly pointed his gun at the haystack. Seeing that Mo Jingshan was silent, he did not move rashly. "Put the gun down." It was obvious that the person in the haystack was very important to him. The man raised his voice and threatened him. The person who came later suddenly said in a low voice, "Why don't we just kill him first, just in case?" "Okay, come at me." Mo Jingshan threw the gun down again. This time he threw it at their feet. The two men laughed as though they had succeeded. One of them stepped forward and kicked Mo Jingshan's knee. Mo Jingshan knelt heavily on one knee. At the same time, the man hit the back of his head with the butt of the gun. In an instant his face turned stiff and pale. But in order not to frighten the woman in the haystack, he didn't make a sound. Mo Jingshan's voice was very low. Even so, Jinwan could still hear the danger in it. "This place has been surrounded and may be bombed at any time. Instead of pledging allegiance to Akib and becoming a desperado with him, why don't you let me go? I'll fight for a chance of survival with 11 base and the police." There was a brief silence. The two men were hesitating. Indeed, they really didn't expect that the American police, who were usually the most difficult to mobilize, would arrive so quickly and spend so many combat resources on so many helicopters. If they delayed any longer, they would really be waiting to be surrounded and annihilated. The cold muzzle was pressed against Mo Jingshan's head. The eyes of the man who came first were full of hesitation, but the eyes of the man who came later were full of killing intent. He didn't believe that they would really leave a chance of survival if they let him go. At the same time, Jinwan in the haystack knew that she couldn't hide anymore. She felt a strong stick in the haystack, which was probably firewood that had not been split. She held the stick tightly in her hand and slowly prepared to get up. While they were not all paying attention to her, she almost jumped out of the haystack and knocked the man closest to the haystack to the ground. As she rushed over, she hit the wrist of the man in front of her hard with the stick in her hand and knocked the gun out of his hand. The two of them were knocked to the ground by a woman who came out of the haystack, and the gun fell to the side. Mo Jingshan picked up the gun almost immediately, but when he raised his head, the man who fell to the ground first had quickly jumped up and pressed the gun against Jinwan's head. The man grabbed Jinwan's arm and pressed the gun against her temple. He stared at Mo Jingshan coldly. "Let's have a try. Let's see who is faster." The gun against Jinwan's temple was cold. It was a long, cold black gun that Jinwan had never seen in High City, or even on TV, glowing with a cold black light. He threatened Mo Jingshan to throw the gun away, but Mo Jingshan held the gun tightly and pointed it at his head, not letting go. The man suddenly sneered and said in Jinwan's ear, "It seems that Mr. Control doesn't care about women. You pretended to be mute and lurked here for 2 or 3 days, but he doesn't even care about your life." The trigger in his hand was slightly pressed, and with a click, it was pressed against her temple. Jinwan's whole body tightened. Mo Jingshan's eyes flickered, and his heart almost stopped beating. At this moment, he finally let go. He slowly bent down and put the gun on the ground. At this time, the other man had also stood up. He took the opportunity to step forward and pick up the gun again. First, he stepped on Mo Jingshan's hand to the ground. Then he turned around and slapped Jinwan hard in the face, cursing her, "Bitch." His wrist bone was almost broken by her strike just now. It was so King painful. He was very cruel, and didn't show any mercy to her because she was a woman. Jinwan's head jerked to one side, and her whole body trembled. Her cheeks quickly swelled up, and the pain numbed her. She could feel that her mouth was broken by her teeth, and the salty liquid spread on the tip of her tongue. Because of the violent movement, her tied-up hair fell down, covering half of her swollen face. She swallowed the blood and didn't say a word, letting her hair cover her face. In this way, Mo Jingshan couldn't see. As long as he couldn't see. Chapter 298. At the same time, the man who had been holding Jinwan suddenly lifted her hair, stared at her for a moment and smiled. 2 days ago, Akib had said that he wanted everyone to have a taste of her. At that time, he didn't have the chance to get too close to her. He only knew that this girl was pretty. Now, he felt that her skin was soft and tender, and she was very beautiful. In particular, her pair of red eyes had a stubborn and unyielding look, which made people want to conquer her. You risked your life to sneak into our place. Who is Mr. Control to you? The man suddenly pinched Jinwan's waist through her white dress. Is he your man? Jinwan looked at him coldly and didn't speak. Now, your lives are in our hands. Even if I press you down here and F***ck you until you cry, I'm afraid your Mr. Control can only watch, the man said and leaned over to kiss her on the cheek. Mo Jingshan struggled to get up, but was kicked in the knee and knocked hard to the ground. He tried to get up again, but the man hit him on the back with the butt of the gun and knocked him hard against a corner of the cabin. Jinwan watched his back hit hard against the corner of the cabin, and at the same time, the man hit him hard with the gun at his waist. These people were vicious. Mo Jingshan hadn't eaten for several days. It was a miracle that he could hold on until now. Without a gun in his hand, he couldn't fight back at all. Mo Jingshan gritted his teeth and said word by word, "Let her go, and I'll go with you. My life can be exchanged for hundreds of millions of dollars at any time. Her existence is of no benefit to you." The man who had just attacked him laughed even more happily. "It seems that you care about this woman very much. Why, is she really your woman?" Mo Jingshan was pressed hard against the wall outside the cabin. Jinwan was pushed to the ground by another man, and the muzzle was still aimed at her temple. The man unhurriedly pinched Jinwan's chin, and suddenly began to tear her clothes. Jinwan's white dress was not very thick or cumbersome. In an instant, one side of her shoulder was directly exposed to the air, and her snow-white and delicate skin dazzled the man's eyes. He looked at her greedily. "It looks good. I wonder how it tastes." The disgusting man pressed against her, but she didn't struggle as violently as before. She looked up calmly and said in English, "Let him go. I'll play alone with you too." The man on top of her looked at her, and was stunned for a moment. Then he laughed. "What's the point of him leaving? I like doing it in front of your man." Jinwan lay there motionless, her heart dead silent. From the moment she was caught, she knew that she might not be able to leave. She was already very fortunate to see Mo Jingshan again in such a place. All the regrets she had missed in her previous life were no longer regrets at this moment. At the very least, she finally saw the complete Mo Jingshan. The Mo Jingshan she did not understand, but the Mo Jingshan was so good. To be able to go through life and death with him at this moment. Perhaps God had given her a chance to love properly and cherish the man she had missed in her previous life. As someone who had died once, it was not that she was not afraid of death, but at this moment, Jinwan was calmer than she thought. At worst, she could bite her tongue and commit suicide. It was not like she had never died before. Perhaps she had more experience than anyone in how to die happily. She just wanted Mo Jingshan to get out of danger. She didn't want to drag him down because of herself. Either way, death was inevitable. Jinwan could only remain calm. There was no need to struggle. The man had already kissed her face again. She moved her head slightly, and his dark and dirty skin formed a sharp contrast with Jinwan's fair face. The smell of sweat on the man's body mixed with the smell of blood. Jinwan felt that her morning sickness was going to break out again, and she wanted to vomit. She resisted and said calmly, "With someone watching, I'll be nervous and won't be able to let go. If I don't let him go, you won't feel happy, will you?" Mo Jingshan, who was pressed against the side of the cabin, clenched his fists so hard that his fingertips dug into his palms, and his knuckles turned blue and white. Every cell in his body was screaming for him to shoot this bastard. He tried his best to restrain the urge to jump up. His eyes were red. But when the man in front of him was also looking at Jinwan with a smile, he reached out to pick up the stick that Jinwan had thrown on the ground. Because Jinwan was too calm, the two men's attention was on her, and their movements revealed some flaws. The sky seemed to be covered with fog by the approaching helicopter, and the sun in the sky seemed to have been set on fire. Just as the man lying on Jinwan was about to tear her clothes down, Mo Jingshan suppressed his anger and almost used all his strength to hit the man who was holding him down, knocking him out completely. The man didn't even have the chance to scream or struggle, and fell to the ground with a muffled sound. Without any hesitation, Mo Jingshan leaped forward and hit the man who was pulling her clothes. The man had only raised his gun halfway when he was hit in the head. Mo Jingshan rushed up with the intention to kill the two men. The two of them immediately fell to the ground with blood all over their heads. They looked even more miserable than the two guards in front of the wooden hut. Jinwan hurriedly sat up in embarrassment. She looked up and was a little stunned to see that the once aloof, calm, and self-controlled man was now as fierce as a trapped beast. He threw down the stick and punched the man who had just pounced on her in the face. One punch after another, the man had already passed out and his face was covered with bruises. Finally, he let go of the dying man, picked up the gun from the ground, and aimed it at him. He pulled the trigger. Seeing that he was going to kill him, Jinwan rushed up and pressed his hand hard. Feng Ling said, "Your hands are clean, and you didn't do anything. You can't kill people for me. Even if these people deserve to die, Mo Jingshan shouldn't be the one whose hands were stained with blood." She couldn't let this man, who had always been pure and handsome, fall into the mud for her. "I'll avenge myself." Jinwan struggled to stand up. She didn't know how to use a long-barreled gun. Besides, if she really fired it here, it would instantly attract the attention of the people in front. She picked up the stick on the ground and hit the unconscious man back and forth, as if she was whipping a corpse. In the end, she deliberately hit the base of his leg. The unconscious man cried out in pain, and blood flowed from his lower body. Dash. Chapter 299. There was blood all over the ground. She couldn't tell whose it was. Mo Jingshan's black shirt hid the color of the blood, but she knew he had been injured just now, and he was seriously injured. Every part of the butt of the gun was hard and sharp. His back and head must have been riddled with scars. On the narrow, damp land behind the cabin, there was a moment of silence because of the two people who had fallen on the ground. Fortunately, Jinwan's shirt had an elastic collar at the shoulder, so it was not torn when it was pulled down. Mo Jingshan tugged the shirt on her shoulder up heavily, took her into his arms without a word, and hugged her hard. He hugged her hard, very hard. Almost as soon as the two people fell to the ground, there was a burst of noise in front of them. The helicopters finally surrounded this place tightly. As Mo Jingshan said, a lot of things had been dropped. Mo Jingshan let go of Jinwan, held her wrist, and pulled her to a place where they would not be hit by the smoke bombs. Mo Jingshan held her tightly. Without saying a word or looking at her again, he pulled her back to the jungle heavily. Her hands, which had been scalded to the point of almost festering, were in so much pain that she felt as if her heart was being torn apart. But Jinwan endured it without saying a word. She knew this pain was not as painful as the pain he felt when he was pressed under someone's body and almost raped. Jinwan didn't ask him to be gentle. She knew that this man, who had always been rational, had lost his mind at this time. She followed him quietly. In front of her was this man, and she could smell his scent. As long as he was still here, nothing was difficult for her. Behind him, she didn't know what to say, because his entire body seemed to be burning with fire. She was a little afraid, and didn't know how to coax him. She couldn't even say, "I'm really fine." She had never seen Mo Jingshan like this before. He could have resisted and escaped, but he didn't. He threw the gun away. He would rather be beaten and face the danger of being shot at any time. Why? Of course it was to protect her. But she had nowhere to hide. Instead of lying in the haystack and watching him with a gun pointed at his head, she would rather rush out. Live and die together? She hadn't thought about it. She only knew that he was Emo Jingshan, her husband, her man, the father of the child in her belly, and the bright light that had guided her in both her past and present lives. Nothing must happen to him. As they walked into the forest, the two of them did not say a word. The smoke bombs began to fall, and the people who were completely surrounded fled in all directions. Jinwan put the damp cloth to her nose and turned to look at Emo Jingshan. She covered her nose and mouth. What should he do? With us here, they won't release any poisonous smoke. As long as you don't breathe too hard, it won't be a problem. It will only cause panic in these people. But now that you're pregnant, you should avoid these gases as much as possible. He didn't look at her, but he answered the question in her mind. Seeing that Jinwan at least knew to cover her mouth and nose at this time, Emo Jingshan's anger gradually calmed down a little, but only a little. He regained his senses and slowly let go of her wrist when he felt the uneven scalded skin in his palm. However, he couldn't bear to look at her eyes that were already red from the pain. Stand here. He paused and didn't say that she hated waiting for him to come back. His tone was cold. I won't go too far. His voice was extremely cold. If Jinwan still followed him out now, he might really lose control. Jinwan stood where she was and didn't speak. Emo Jingshan stubbornly clung onto the last bit of rationality that was about to be burnt out. Her silence only caused the killing intent in his heart to increase. He abruptly walked out. Jinwan stood there as he said, didn't move, and didn't follow him at all. She saw Emo Jingshan pick up the gun on the ground. When he straightened up, Jinwan accurately caught a flash of hesitation on his face, which was obviously in pain. His back, his head, and the places she couldn't see were all covered with wounds. Standing in the dense forest, looking at the dense mass of helicopters flying over, she narrowed her eyes and didn't move. She was a little uneasy because she couldn't see the situation in the camp, but Emo Jingshan didn't go far. He seemed to have figured out all the places in the camp before she did, and was walking toward the front of the camp. Soon, the helicopter landed on an open space closest to Jinwan. It seemed that Emo Jingshan had known this would be the best place to land. A middle-aged man in an American police uniform quickly got off the helicopter. When he saw Jinwan, who was not deliberately hiding in the dense forest, he walked up to her with a gun, thinking that she was an accomplice of these people, because she was wearing the white dress of the women in this area. Who are you? The policeman looked at her cautiously and seriously. Jinwan opened her mouth. Although her face was a little dirty, her pure Asian image should be recognized by these people. She raised her hand to wipe her face and said calmly in English, I'm Chinese. I'm Emo Jingshan's wife. Hearing the words Emo Jingshan's wife, the American policeman was puzzled but obviously didn't believe her. At this moment, the door of a black helicopter that landed behind them opened, and Feng Ling rushed out and hurried over. Mrs. Emo. Hearing Feng Ling's voice, the policeman hesitated and slowly put down the gun. Feng Ling quickly stepped forward and grabbed Jinwan's hand. Mrs. Emo, how are you? I'm sorry we're late. We've been waiting for this batch of helicopters to rescue us. After all, the ambush here is very deep. If we don't make thorough preparations, we're likely to fail. But we've been delayed for 2 days. You must have suffered. Before she finished speaking, she suddenly looked down at the back of Jinwan's hand and frowned. Without asking more questions, she pulled Jinwan back to the helicopter. How did your hand get hurt like this? There's a medicine box on the helicopter. Let me help you. I'm fine. As Jinwan was pulled away by Feng Ling, she turned to look in the direction of Emo Jingshan's departure. Where is Emo Jingshan? Mr. Emo should go to meet Nanheng now. Don't worry, Nanheng's plane arrived earlier than us. Now the front has been controlled. The minefield in this dense forest is likely to be detonated by those fleeing people. You're pregnant and can't smell the smoke. It's easy to hurt the baby. Hurry up and get on the helicopter. Chapter 300. The helicopter didn't fly as slowly and steadily as a regular plane. When it took off, Jinwan couldn't hold back her morning sickness anymore. Even if she wanted to ask Emo Jingshan when he would get out of danger with them, she couldn't ask. Because as soon as the helicopter took off, Jinwan ran to the toilet in the bathroom and vomited for a long time. In the end, she knelt by the toilet and lost all her strength. She hadn't eaten much these days, but because she was pregnant and couldn't lack nutrition, she insisted on eating as much as possible. But she didn't eat much. Now she vomited all the food she had eaten in the past few days. When she was pressed to the ground by that disgusting man, she wanted to vomit and had been holding back until now. Mrs. Mo. Feng Ling had found the spare medicine box on the helicopter. She turned around and saw Jinwan lying by the toilet, so she reached out to help her up. Jinwan was helplessly helped out. Sitting in the cabin, Feng Ling took a cushion and put it behind her for Jinwan to lean on. Can you hold on? This helicopter is here to pick you up. Now we'll send you out. You'll feel much better after landing. Just hold on a little longer. It's just morning sickness. I don't have any disease. Jinwan leaned back weakly and looked at her with her eyes slightly open. You don't have to send me out on this helicopter. I'll wait for them with you. You can do whatever you need to do with the people in the base. I can do it alone. Feng Ling looked at her and didn't speak. She just took Jinwan's hand and quickly applied medicine on the back of her hand, asking, Is this a burn? Why is it so hot? I did it on purpose. They asked me to send him food and set up a trap. Whether he ate it or not, it would be the worst result. In order to prevent him from facing this choice, I spilled the whole pot of boiling soup on my hand, Jinwan said in a low voice. Feng Ling paused and then frowned. Perhaps you should let Mr. Mo make the decision. He must have a way to ensure that you won't be implicated. At the same time, he can protect himself. Jinwan was silent for a moment before saying, Indeed, if I had thrown this difficult problem to him, he might have handled it well. But I didn't think that much at that time, so I used the stupidest method. This isn't a stupid method. Perhaps it's because when you've reached a certain level of love, you'd rather be scarred than let the other party suffer. Mrs. Mo, you've already done very well. As Feng Ling spoke, she took out gauze to bandage Jinwan's hand. Let's deal with it this way first. Your injury is a bit too serious. I can't give you medicine casually even though you're pregnant. When you return safely, I'll deal with it properly. Jinwan raised her eyes to look at Feng Ling gratefully. Thank you. The helicopter hovered over the center of the dense camp, neither leaving nor descending. Jinwan no longer felt nauseous because of the stability. She closed her eyes and calmed down for a moment, then turned to lean against the open cabin door with Feng Ling and looked down. They didn't fly very high, so they could still see the messy crowd in the camp under the control of the police. But they didn't see Nanheng, Mo Jingshan, Akib, or Dolly. However, she suddenly caught a glimpse of the old woman who had fallen by the tent. The old woman was motionless. She didn't know whether she had fainted or been shot in the random gunfire. Jinwan's heart skipped a beat. This old woman had been with Akib for many years. Although she didn't know whether she was a servant or a relative of Akib, at least in the past few days, this old woman had dressed her, bandaged her hand, and protected her. But Jinwan also knew that the old woman was in poor health and couldn't work or cook. So she forced Jinwan to stay here to take over her work. Her original intention might not be good, but if it hadn't been for the old woman's occasional help these 2 days, Jinwan might have been humiliated or faced a more difficult situation. Feng Ling, do you see the old woman by the tent? Jinwan asked. Feng Ling glanced down. I see it. What happened to her? Dead. Their own people shot indiscriminately. She was killed by their own people's guns. There was a moment of silence in the air. Jinwan turned back, leaned against the cabin, and no longer looked down. After a moment of silence, she said hoarsely, If these people can leave their bodies intact, please tell them to bury this old woman well. Feng Ling didn't ask more, but turned to look at Jinwan's dirty and blood-stained white dress, guessing that it probably belonged to the old woman. Okay. After a while, there was a commotion below. No matter which side it was, there must be a lot of casualties. Jinwan really couldn't watch anymore. She raised her hand to cover her tumbling stomach and sat there quietly. Mrs. Mo, shall we go back? I'll wait for him here, Jinwan insisted. At this height, they were already at a safe distance from the ground. This place wouldn't affect anyone below, so Feng Ling respected Jinwan's choice. If she insisted on staying here with Mr. Mo, Feng Ling wouldn't force her, as long as Jinwan's body could bear it. After all, this kind of helicopter with the cabin door open was too torturous for a pregnant woman like Jinwan. She didn't know how much time had passed. Jinwan had been sitting in the cabin, listening to the whirring sound of the propeller, but it gave her a great sense of security. She knew that she had broken free from the camp, where she could almost lose her life at any time. Knowing that Mo Jingxian had met up with Nan Heng and the others, she gradually relaxed. She tried not to listen to what was happening below the helicopter. Even if she heard something, she could only treat it as watching a war movie. Otherwise, she would really have nightmares if she saw such a bloody scene. She fell asleep. Time passed bit by bit, and the sun rose from the east to the center, and from the center to the west. Suddenly, she felt a slight bump in the plane. Jinwan opened her eyes with a jerk, and the moment she turned her head, she heard Feng Ling say, "Mrs. Mo, we're landing now." "Okay," Jinwan responded. He did not know when the cabin door had been closed. No wonder she was sleeping so peacefully. At this moment, Feng Ling suddenly opened the cabin door and heard her say, "Mr. Mo is back." Chapter 301. What entered her nose was the refreshing scent of the man's body, mixed with bits of blood. But on his body, it was not unpleasant at all. Jinwan did not even raise her head. She held the man's waist tightly and refused to let go. Feng Ling consciously stood by the side and did not make a sound. She nodded politely and respectfully to Mo Jingxian, who had just come in, and turned to get off the helicopter. There was a metal partition between the cabin and the cockpit. They could not see the front from here, and the pilot in the cockpit could not see them either. Mo Jingxian held the agitated little woman in his arms tightly and silently carried her in. Usually, he would carry her as though he was casually picking up a piece of clothing. But right now, the moment he straightened his back, his body trembled, and he almost lost his footing. But it did not affect him. When Jinwan sensed his pain and was about to withdraw from his arms, he held her tightly and did not let her move away. "You're injured." Jinwan's words were no longer as calm and composed as before in the face of danger. Instead, the lingering fear had covered all her courage. Her hands tightly grasped the blood-stained shirt on his back. Now the blood had dried on his back, and the shirt was stuck to the skin on his back. Mo Jingxian lowered his eyes to look at the little woman who only now knew fear. This woman had not even changed her clothes. Aside from her hands being rebandaged, her face was still covered in dirt. Her white dress was mixed with mud and blood. She looked very disheveled, but her eyes were still clear and bright. "Why didn't you let Feng Ling send you back?" Mo Jingxian asked, his voice right above her head. His voice was as clear and clean as ever, but it was much hoarser and heavier because of the many days of torture. But in Jinwan's ears, it sounded like the world depended on him. He was alive. They were all alive. They were all safe. "I don't want to be so far away from you." Feng Ling said, "It's very safe here, and nothing will happen to you." "Since it's safe, of course I don't need to leave." Jinwan hugged him tightly, but her hands were careful not to touch his seriously injured back. "When can we get out of here completely? You need to see a doctor about your injury." The man gently pulled her hand away from his waist. He lowered his eyes to see that she still had the strength to cry, and the trace of warmth between his brows instantly turned cold. He stared at her with his ink-black eyes. "In the future, no matter where I am, you're not allowed to take this risk again. I told you to wait for me, so wait for me obediently. Is Cambodia a place where you can come and go as you please?" As expected, the lesson that should have come had still come. Jinwan pursed her lips and did not speak. She raised her reddened eyes to look at him, as though she had turned back into the pitiful little mute who frequently brought him food these past 2 days. No matter how he glared at her, how he coldly, or how he scolded her, she did not speak. Meeting her gaze, Mo Jingxian's chest trembled. What happened today was 100 times more painful for him than for her. And it was even harder for him to get over this hurdle. The moment he thought of the scene where she was almost violated, his sky was about to collapse. He should have sent more people to guard her from the start. If one Feng Ling was not enough, he should have sent 10 more to keep a close eye on her. He could not give her any chance to take any risks. She was pregnant, yet she still dared to run to Cambodia. This woman was truly audacious. Why aren't you speaking? He forcefully controlled his expression to not be too soft-hearted. I'm waiting for you to finish lecturing me, ah. These past few days, I've indeed been shaken to the core. Only after you're done scolding me can I feel a sense of having escaped from a dragon's pool or a tiger's den. That way, I'll feel more comfortable. Mo Jingshan's gaze was quiet and dark. Will you only be satisfied when my heart jumps out of my body? Jin Wan stared at him, her hands tugging at his blood-stained black shirt. I only want you to live. In that instant, he felt an unbearable piercing pain in his eyes. In the 26 years of his life, other than a few teardrops around the age of 2, when he was learning to speak, the man, who had never shed a single tear since he was 3, was almost instantly blinded by the stinging sensation. His eyes turned bloodshot. Mo Jingshan, I only want you to live. Even if you didn't come to T-City to pick me up as promised, I'll still come to find you. As long as you're alive, I can go anywhere to find you. In the sky or on the ground, in the past or present life. As long as you're around, I'll overcome all obstacles. I only want you to live. The man abruptly kissed her. There was a salty and fishy taste in his mouth. It was the taste of blood. Previously, when he was injured, he had forcefully swallowed the blood in his throat to prevent Jin Wan from worrying. Jin Wan took into account that she had just vomited several hours ago. Even though she had rinsed her mouth, she had not brushed her teeth for several days. Mo Jingshan did not eat or drink anything. Aside from the smell of blood, there was nothing else on him. He was as clear and clean as ever, but she felt that right now she might be stinky. She struggled in his arms, but the man kissed her even deeper. He held the back of her head tightly and circled her, as if he wanted to rub her into his body. In the past, whether it was in T-City or High City, she was a spoiled young lady who had to shower twice a day. He was also the high and mighty CEO of Mo Corporation, who was obsessed with cleanliness to a certain extent. But at this moment, throwing away the blood-stained ground and the shackles of various identities and habits, there was only him and her here. It was pure him and her. The last string of reason in Mo Jingshan's mind was almost broken by her. Reason and responsibility, marriage and kindness, and the growing strong feelings for each other could not compare to this woman, whose heart was more determined than his at this moment. He was afraid that in this life, he would really be completely buried in her hands. Gradually Jin Wan stopped struggling. Her entire body leaned into his embrace. This was compromise, this was submission, and she did not want to resist anymore. She hugged his neck tightly, and took the initiative to kiss him back. Finally, the hand that was hugging the back of his neck instinctively moved to stroke his hair. Her fingers had just brushed past the back of his head when the man suddenly paused. He released her lips and gave a low moan. It was clear that he was in so much pain that he could no longer hold it in. Jin Wan subconsciously rushed to put down her hand. When she lowered her head, she saw that her fingers were stained with blood. It had been several hours since Mo Jingshan's back and head were smashed by the gun, but in the morning, the blood on his back had already dried and stuck to his shirt. However, the blood on his head had not dried yet. It was clear how badly he had been smashed. Mo Jingshan pressed down her blood-stained hand. His tone was calm. It's all right. They're all external wounds. It'll be fine after we get them bandaged. Jin Wan tried hard to hold back her tears. She did not want to become a burden in his heart. She sniffled and raised her eyes to look at him. She said calmly, Feng Ling left the first aid kit here. I'll help you clean your wounds, all right? Dash. Jin Wan hugged his neck and buried her face in it, not speaking. Today, you put yourself in danger, and even wanted to use your body as a bargaining chip to ensure my safety. I don't want this to happen a second time ever. His hand was wrapped around her waist. Even though he hadn't eaten for many days, his hand was still firm and strong. She knew that at that time, Mo Jingshan's emotions had been turned upside down. Jin Wan obediently sat in his arms, softly making an N sound, and did not refute. Right now he was an injured patient. Whatever he said was the truth. She would not argue with him, nor would she be stubborn with him. All right, it's just an external injury. Wipe your tears. The man patted her head again. Go get some warm water, and wipe it down along the wound on my back. This way my clothes can be removed. Jinwon wiped her eyes, and stood up to do as he said. She went to the bathroom to get some warm water. Just as she was about to continue treating his wounds, she hesitated. You're already injured like this. If you touch water, won't it be fine? Since it's already like this, there's no difference whether you touch water or not. Remove your clothes first, and then disinfect them. Mo Jingshan remained calm. Compared to her flustered state, there was indeed a huge difference between a man and a woman's calmness and intelligence in the face of danger. Jinwon was about to touch the water, when Mo Jingshan suddenly glanced at the gauze on her hand. Forget it. You can do it when we go back. Your hand can't do it. I'm fine. Feng Ling has already helped me. My right fingertip isn't injured. I only need to hold on to the towel here. Otherwise, do you want Feng Ling to come in and help you take off your clothes? Mo Jingshan glanced at her hand again. After confirming that she knew what she was doing, he did not speak again. Jinwon dipped the towel in the hot water and gently poured some on his back. She felt that the muscles on the man's back had only slightly tightened. Other than that, he did not make a sound. As he said, he was also human. He would also feel pain. Jinwon helped him moisten the wound bit by bit, and then tore off the wet shirt bit by bit. This method could indeed prevent too much flesh and blood from being torn off. She then helped him wipe the area around the wound with water. After confirming that the blood had been wiped clean, she picked up the disinfectant to help him apply. Mo Jingshan, if it hurts, just bite the towel. Don't hold it in. It's not like I'll laugh at you. Earlier, when Feng Ling helped him apply the disinfectant to his hand, she was in so much pain that she broke out in cold sweat. However, she endured it and did not make a sound. How big of an injury was that? It was only scalded to the surface of his skin. Mo Jingshan's wound was deep within his flesh. The man did not speak, but she clearly heard him chuckle. Her heart ached for him, yet he was still in the mood to laugh. Jinwon's originally heavy heart suddenly calmed down, due to his low chuckle. In the end, she did not hesitate, and chose to quickly help him disinfect the wound. She then applied some simple medicine, and took out some gauze from the medicine box. She wrapped it around his body, and in the end his chest and back were wrapped like a heavily injured patient in an ancient television drama. It was almost as though he was wearing a white vest. I suddenly regret not studying medicine back then. Seeing that Mo Jingshan only lowered his head to take a look, but did not say anything, Jinwon felt slightly embarrassed as she muttered. Mo Jingshan narrowed his eyes slightly and chuckled. He calmly said, regardless of whether you study medicine or finance, you don't need to use this kind of external bandaging. However, it's still more important to understand the difference between a first kiss and artificial respiration as soon as possible. Jinwon's hand that was helping him treat the wound on his head paused. She looked at him in surprise. What artificial respiration? The man chuckled again. All right, now isn't the time to talk about this. Are you sure your hand is fine? It's not a problem. At the very least, I'll help you disinfect the wound first. Otherwise, it'll be easy to get infected in this tropical area. Jinwon continued to focus on applying medicine. However, earlier, when he said something about a first kiss and artificial respiration. Chapter 303. She had just helped Mo Jingshan deal with the wound on his head, when the cabin door opened once more. Feng Ling was about to enter when she saw that Mo Jingshan's black shirt had been tossed to the side. She paused and decisively took a step back. She did not enter but said from outside, Mr. Mo, the commander of the American police force, Officer Entz, is looking for you. Jinwon rushed to hold him down. She did not wish for him to go out in his injured state. However, Mo Jingshan pressed down on her hand on his shoulder and patted it comfortingly. At the same time he said to the outside, I understand. After speaking, he turned to glance at Jinwon. Officer Entz and I used to be friends. This time, He specially flew over from America to Cambodia. It's not as simple as a rescue mission. He has his own interests. Let's go talk. Rest here. Feng Ling will accompany you. Jin Wan's hand left his body. Where do we talk? Not far. The people in the center of the camp have already been restrained. The surrounding area has also been surrounded by the base personnel and the police. It's very safe. We're only going to talk on paper. There won't be any violence. We'll be back soon, in? He pinched her face. It was not easy to pull him back to her side, but there were still so many follow-up problems that required him to personally deal with them. He was clearly injured to this extent, yet he could not rest properly. Jin Wan was unwilling, but she could not drag him along. She nodded. All right. Mo Jingshan picked up the blood-stained black shirt. Jin Wan was about to say that the shirt was covered in blood, but there were no other clothes he could wear here. Her words were stuck in her throat. Thankfully, the shirt was black. If she did not know better, she would not have noticed the bloodstains. Mo Jingshan casually buttoned up a few buttons. Aside from the light stubble on his chin and his slightly paler complexion, he did not seem to have changed much. His body was covered in injuries, but he did not appear to be in a sorry state. In comparison, Jin Wan's white sarong dress was too tragic to look at. She watched as the man walked out of the cabin door. Jin Wan followed him, but before she could step out, she was blocked by Feng Ling. Mrs. Mo, rest inside. Don't come out, Feng Ling said. Jin Wan glanced at the camp not far away. The path she had walked for the past 2 days was covered in blood, and the gangsters lay motionless, covered in blood. The nausea in her stomach returned. She turned around and sat down in the cabin. It was indeed not suitable for her to go out. In the country, in High City, and in the peace society for too many years, this was the first time she had faced such chaos and killing. Looking at the ground covered in blood and different types of empty bullet casings, she was afraid that she would have nightmares for 2 years. Feng Ling dutifully guarded outside. After a while, she said a few words to the people outside the helicopter, and then entered the cabin. You're not going to sleep? Feng Ling asked, seeing Jin Wan's eyes were wide open. A few hours ago, I fell asleep when there was a series of gunshots. I slept for a few hours, so I don't feel sleepy now. Jin Wan leaned against the wall of the cabin and said with emotion, Feng Ling, I feel that these days it's like watching a movie. Feng Ling chuckled. How can you watch a movie with your hands full of injuries? At least he survived, didn't he? At least Mo Jingshan is safe. Jin Wan turned to look at her. That's true. These years, I've been on missions in the base and seen too many deaths. Being alive is indeed more important than anything else. Whether it's an unexpected experience or a peaceful life, it's all fleeting. Perhaps, as you said, as long as some things are in the past, they're just a movie in life. Feng Ling smiled. Jin Wan glanced at her again. Past. Do you think the incident of taking contraceptives in T-City can be forgotten so easily? Just pretend that it never happened. Feng Ling immediately put on a serious face. For the past few days, Jin Wan had not dared to smile. Now, she laughed out loud and tilted her head to look at her. I'm really curious about how you and Nan Hung came to be. You used to be brothers. What happened later? Feng Ling was expressionless. Now we're still brothers. Really? Jin Wan curved her lips. Why do I feel that you treat him as a brother, but he treats you as his woman? Mrs. Mo, did your hand get wet earlier? Feng Ling suddenly looked at her and stiffly changed the topic. Jin Wan saw Feng Ling suddenly pick up the medicine box. Why don't I sterilize your hand again? Forget it. It hurts. Jin Wan put her hand behind her back. She felt that every time Feng Ling encountered a topic related to Nan Hung, she would not be so calm and even irritable. Forget it. She would not hurt her. Her own husband was not obediently resting with her. She could not even control her own man. How could she have the energy to care about Feng Ling's matters? But then again, if Mo Jingshan was like a towering ancient tree with deep roots in the soil, constantly sheltering her from the wind and rain, then perhaps Nan Hung was like the wind. Not only was this kind of man unfathomable, but he was also so far away that it was hard to reach. With Feng Ling's personality, if she really became serious, who knew how badly she would be bullied? so it was better for Feng Ling to continue following her. After about 2 hours, it was already dark. Feng Ling went to get some dry bread and mineral water for Jinwan to fill her stomach. But Jinwan could not eat. Although the cabin door was closed, she could still smell the blood on the ground outside. Besides, Mo Jingshan had not eaten or drunk for so many days. He should not have eaten anything yet. How could she eat? Seeing Jinwan holding the dry bread in her hand, but staring at the gauze in her hand, Feng Ling knew that she needed some time to calm down. After all, the experience these days should be unforgettable. Feng Ling did not speak. She opened the door, got off the plane, and went outside to check on the injuries of the other brothers in the base. It was not until the surrounding dense forest was filled with the exclusive sounds of insects at night, because of the darkness, that Mo Jingshan finally returned. Mo Jingshan entered the cabin door, saw the undamaged bread and unopened mineral water in Jinwan's hands, and asked her, "Why don't you eat?" Hearing his voice, Jinwan abruptly returned to herself. She stood up and held the two things in her hands toward him. "For you." Mo Jingshan stared at her for a long moment before slowly smiling. He walked over and brought the little woman who was looking forward to him eating into his arms. "I've already drunk some water in the afternoon and had a simple meal. I'm not hungry right now." Chapter 304. After that, I don't feel hungry anymore. I can't eat too much at once, or my stomach won't be able to take it. Tomorrow, I'll go back to eating normally. Be good and eat. Don't worry about me. As Mo Jingshan spoke, he touched her slightly ashen face. Right now, you have to eat two people's meals. These days, you haven't even had enough nutrition. Now you can't even bear to eat bread. Those who don't know might think that I bullied Mrs. Mo. Jinwan buried her face in his chest. Thankfully, your most serious injuries are on your back. Otherwise, I wouldn't even be able to lean against your arms. Because 11 Base had wounded people who had jumped down from the helicopter and been shot at, they quickly flew out of the dense forest after cooperating with the police to take photos and collect evidence. The injured people's conditions were not stable. Thankfully, 11 Base had a doctor with them. When the plane landed, Jinwan learned that in order to take care of the injured people, they had to rest in the previous warehouse and bulletproof shed for the night. After their injuries stabilized, they would be sent back to America for better treatment. Jinwan had stayed here for 2 days and was not unfamiliar with it. However, as soon as Mo Jingshan arrived, he did not stop and directly went out with Nanheng. Late at night, Jinwan took out the phone that Feng Ling had kept for her and glanced at the time. It was almost midnight. Injured to this extent, he still didn't rest and still had things to discuss so late at night. Did he not want his wife or his life anymore? Not long after, when Mo Jingshan entered Jinwan's cubicle, he saw that the little woman's face was unhappy. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. I was too busy looking at my phone earlier and forgot the time. I'm going to change. You go out first." Jinwan did not look at him. Seeing that this little woman actually gave him an unpleasant look, Mo Jingshan glanced at her clothes. It was a local white dress that Feng Ling had specially bought from the farm across the tunnel Sap Lake. It was more fitting than the one Jinwan was wearing. The style was not too plain, and was more suitable for young people. He smiled faintly. "Change." Jinwan had yet to realize what his playful expression meant, and stood up to push him out. "Go out." "Why should I go out? Not only do I need to change, I also need to shower." Jinwan pointed to the bucket of hot water in the room. "I haven't showered for days. It's so smelly." Originally, she had planned to wait for Mo Jingshan to come back, so that he could shower first. Yet it took so long for him to come back. She had a stomach full of anger. "Let's not talk about the fact that there's no need for me to go out when you shower." Mo Jingshan's thin lips held in a smile. He purposely glanced at her hand that had been wrapped up like a dumpling by the base doctor. Jinwan. In the afternoon, the bandage Feng Ling helped her bandage wasn't so thick or tight. At that time, her fingers could still move. T. T to say T. I. T T. 2. G and T. T to T. 2. T. T. Her heart tightened. The moment she opened the door, the man's long arm reached out and closed it. Jinwon turned to look at him. In such a peaceful night, although the smell of blood on his body had faded, the two of them were injured. Their gazes met. Seeing his ink-black eyes, her heart suddenly tightened. "Why don't you shower first?" He glanced at her hands and directly lifted his hand to strip her dress from her shoulders down. Jinwon. Although the man's back and head were injured, it did not affect his hands. He took it off naturally, as though he was peeling an orange. In the blink of an eye, Jinwon's almost white dress was peeled off. "It's not like I haven't helped you shower before. Are you embarrassed now?" After taking off her clothes, the man's tone was light. He then glanced at the wooden bucket over there. "This way of bathing is really primitive. Even if I help you wash such a small wooden bucket, I don't have the extra space to do anything to you. Jinwon, even if there's space, you can't do anything to me now. You're not allowed to do anything in the first 3 months of pregnancy." Mo Jingshan raised his eyebrows and looked at her deeply. "Did Qin Sighting tell you this?" "No, when I was looking at my phone, I read some common knowledge about pregnancy. You're very timely. Otherwise, what do you want to do with your injuries? You haven't eaten for several days. Do you think your stamina is endless?" "Stamina depends on what it is." Jinwon. Sitting in this small wooden tub, Jinwon was a bit absent-minded. This kind of primitive bathing method made her wonder what kind of life the local people in Cambodia lived. When she left the airport, she saw many modern buildings and many fashionable people passing by. Their lives were also very peaceful. But in these villages near Tunnel Sap Lake, the way of life was probably very different from that in the city. Seeing Mo Jingshan roll up his sleeves and come over, Jinwon looked at the man's face through the mist and suddenly said, "Why don't you let Feng Ling help me wash?" When saying this, she actually hesitated. Although she and Feng Ling were both women, they had never been naked. If Feng Ling really came, perhaps it would also be awkward. She really didn't like others touching her. She was only used to Mo Jingshan. But Mo Jingshan's injuries were much more serious than hers. The man's hand had already reached into the water. He tested the water temperature, and then swept the water over her exposed shoulder. His tone was still light. "I don't allow others to touch you, not men, not even Feng Ling, who can switch between men and women." What did he mean by switch between men and women? Feng Ling had only been pretending to be a man in the base. She was clearly a woman inside and out. But since things had already come to this, Jinwon didn't say anything more. She leaned against the wooden bucket, allowing the man's hand to help her bathe. She said, "By the way, I might not have a chance to go back to the condo next to T University. Should I sell it or?" Before she could finish speaking, she suddenly felt her vision darken. She opened her eyes to see that the man had lowered his head. His cool, pleasant scent drowned her senses. Her breath was immediately filled with his scent. She was startled. What are you doing?" The man raised her chin with his fingers. He looked at her cheeks that had become much thinner and said hoarsely, "Wait a moment before bathing. Let's kiss for a while first." Chapter 305. He said he would kiss for a while longer. But once they started, it was almost impossible to stop. Jinwon pushed him away symbolically. Usually she couldn't push him away. Now that her hands were wrapped up, she couldn't move at all. Their lips and teeth intertwined. She closed her eyes, and the man's arms held her armpits, almost carrying her out of the water. Jinwon still remembered the injury on his back. Right now he definitely couldn't push his arms forward like this. She subconsciously moved back, and her bright red lips moved. "Don't. You're injured." Even though she ended the long kiss before it got out of hand, when she spoke, her face was still flushed, and she looked even more charming in the steam rising from her face. Mo Jingshan planted a kiss on the corner of her lips, then on her cheeks, and finally on her ears. His clear, low, and husky voice was very, very gentle. "Do you know what I was thinking when you suddenly knelt before me that day?" "What were you thinking?" "I wanted to fly back to High City immediately. I'd rather have you kneel in bed with your back facing me and beg for mercy than see you kneel before me in that way." When Mo Jingshan finished speaking, he suddenly bit her fair ear. Jinwon shivered in pain, and then heard the man say hoarsely, "You knew I was trying my best to bear it, yet you still dared to kneel. You did it on purpose, en?" Jinwan shrank her neck in the water. She felt the man's pressure pressing against her, and she was almost squeezed into this small wooden bucket. "I knew you hadn't eaten or drunk anything for several days, and I was afraid your body wouldn't be able to take it. I was too anxious, and those people kept staring at me. If I didn't pretend to be too helpless, I might have been shot in the head at any time. I still have to live and soar together with you. I don't want to die." Jinwan's voice became softer and softer, until it became a soft murmur. He stared at her and did not speak. His hand touched the back of her head, pausing on her black hair. Jinwan's heart swelled under his gaze. "Emo Jingshan, en?" She pursed her lips, and her tone carried a hint of lingering fear. "They said you haven't been involved in the underworld. So after this, can we directly return to High City? Or do you want to return to America with Nan Hung and the others?" The man looked at her face under her long hair and smiled. He touched her wet hair. "Do you want to go back to High City? It's still more comfortable at home. I might need some time to digest and forget what happened in the past few days. I'm afraid the baby in my tummy won't be able to take it if I keep feeling so nervous." As she spoke, she gently stroked her flat belly with her hand that had been submerged in the water. Emo Jingshan's gaze was gentle, watching her movements underwater. His lips curved up slightly. "All right. Once this matter is settled, we'll return to High City. Okay, I'll bathe for a while." "You don't have to help me. Just soak in the water for a while. I'll help you when you bathe." Emo Jingshan made an end sound, turning to pick up the clean white dress she had placed on the bed, placing it by the side. After the bath, she came out of the wooden tub. Perhaps it was because she hadn't had such intimate contact in a long time. Or perhaps it was because she had just experienced a life and death situation. But she felt a little embarrassed to have this familiar yet strange man help her bathe. Thus, when Emo Jingshan was about to help her put on the dress, Jinwan looked at him with a bashful expression. "Can't you close your eyes?" Emo Jingshan glanced at her cheeks, which were red from being soaked in the hot water, or because of a moment of shyness. "No, Jinwan." "Very good." He had just returned, and he had regained his rights as a husband. After a few seconds of stalemate, Jinwan compromised and raised her arm. When the man helped her put on the dress, to relieve the awkwardness of standing naked before him, Jinwan cleared her throat. "Don't you think I've gained a little weight?" Emo Jingshan was helping her tie the white ribbon in front of her dress. His slender fingers shuffled through the ribbon, his voice mild. "After these days of struggle, you've clearly lost weight. How could you have gained weight?" "But I'm pregnant." "Anyone who is pregnant will gain weight." The man helped her tie the ribbon, and raised his hand to push her long hair behind her back. There was no hairdryer here, so she could only let it dry naturally. At the same time, because of her words, he carefully looked at her from head to toe and finally commented, "You've lost at least 5 pounds." She said she was fat, but he insisted on saying she was thin. "Also, who told you that pregnant people will definitely gain weight? How long have you been pregnant? Your belly will only be visible after at least 2 months. There won't be any changes to your figure." "How did you know? Have you read any pregnancy-related books?" Emo Jingshan glanced at the little woman who suddenly leaned into his arms. She had just bathed, and her cheeks were still slightly red. His Adam's apple moved. He stared at the side of her face. Under the light in the cubicle, he could clearly see her thick, long eyelashes and the warm, clear outline of her cheeks. 2 months ago, when Auntie Chun had nothing to do, she would always talk about these things by my side, asking me to pay attention to whether you were pregnant or not. She was worried that there would be no one to take care of you in T-City, so she would often nag at me after I got off work and returned to the U Garden. The man's voice was mild and hoarse. "Ha, grandfather and Auntie Chun together are like a large army. A captain and a deputy captain." She watched as Emo Jingshan, dressed in a blood-stained black shirt, and filled with a dispirited and cold aura, transformed back into a clean, white t-shirt President Emo. Jinwan sat on the bed watching the man clean his stubble, and was almost dazed. Most adult men would grow stubble if they did not shave for a day or two. In the past, Emo Jingshan had always been clean like this. His image was good, and his aura was excellent. Whenever he stood there, he would be a scenery. However, his unkempt appearance these days gave off a different feeling. It was not ugly, and it could even move the tiny bit of worship and excitement hidden in a woman's heart. He was especially good-looking and attractive. However, she quickly returned to her senses. Earlier, when she was helping him bathe, she saw that the wound on his back needed to be treated by the base doctor again. Thus, she quickly kept the blood-stained black shirt on the ground. Thankfully, Nanhing's figure is similar to yours. His t-shirt doesn't look out of place on you at all. However, when Jinwan walked past him, she spoke with a young maiden's heart pounding. You look much more approachable in a t-shirt than in a shirt. Chapter 306. Hearing this, Emo Jingshan gave her a meaningful look. She put away the red hearts that were about to pop out of her eyes, turned around, and walked out quickly with his clothes in her arms. At the same time, she went to look for the base doctor who had just gotten free, and asked him to help disinfect and apply medicine to Emo Jingshan's wounds. The base doctor had just come over from the more seriously injured patients, and was about to come to see Mr. Emo. Seeing Mrs. Emo come out, he nodded politely to Jinwan, and walked straight inside. Are you feeling refreshed after taking a shower, changing your clothes, and seeing your man return safely? Even when you walk, you look like you're floating. A voice came from outside the door. It was cold and indifferent with a hint of mockery. Jinwan looked sideways, and saw the figure standing in front of the door with a cigarette in his mouth. She saw Nanheng take the cigarette out of his mouth, and narrowed his eyes coldly at her. I've been nervous for a few days, and I've just relaxed a little. Can't you let me get carried away? She laughed. Nanheng snorted. My t-shirt is new and I haven't worn it yet. It should fit your man, right? It fits quite well. Both of you are 1.88 meters tall, Jinwan casually replied. As long as it fits. Nanheng glanced at her again. But in this base, only you and Feng Ling are women. Feng Ling is a little taller than you, and she only has the base's combat uniform. It's not suitable for you to wear it, so we can only buy this kind of skirt. Jinwan tugged at the hem of her dress. I look good too. It's rare for me to wear such a loose dress. It's quite ethnic. I didn't realize it in the past, but Miss Ji has really become more and more easygoing. Compared to her arrogant self in the past, it's been especially obvious in the past few days. This Nanheng really wanted to diss her for no reason at all. Jinwan was used to it. She only smiled and did not say much. She was about to take the black shirt out when Nanheng glanced at it, asking, Are you going to wash this? Yeah. It's covered in blood, and the back is damaged in many places. I can't wear it even if I wash it. What's the point of washing it? Wash it and bring it back. It's good to keep it as a souvenir. Nanheng sneered and looked at her as if she was crazy. Commemorate what? To commemorate the life and death of your man? Or to commemorate the bloody scene in this broken place? These words really made people lose their appetites. Jinwan pursed her lips, and was hesitating whether she should throw the shirt away. All of a sudden, Nanheng seemed to recall something. He glanced at her and asked, You didn't tell him that you washed our socks for us, did you? No. Jinwan had yet to finish when she suddenly heard Emo Jingshan's voice behind her. What do you mean by washing socks? Jinwan. Nanheng. Nanheng narrowed his eyes and took a puff of his cigarette. Then he threw the cigarette butt on the ground, and stepped on it to extinguish it. He said indifferently, Akib and Dolly are still in the jungle, and there's always a team of people protecting them. The hidden position should be the ambush point that they had set up before entering, and they're just waiting for us to go over. But it's useless even if they manage to escape for one night. Tomorrow morning, Officer Entz and I will go in and search again to see if they've already been blown up by the minefield. Rest well. Before Emo Jingshan could speak, Jinwan turned to look at him. Didn't the base doctor go in earlier? Why did you come out without treating your wound? The doctor is currently preparing medicine. He'll return in 5 minutes to apply the medicine. Emo Jingshan looked at her, and then at the shirt in her hands. Throw it away. Jinwan thought about it and agreed. This shirt was not only stained with Emo Jingshan's blood, but also those people's blood. Thinking that those people were almost all dead by now, she felt a chill run down her spine, and decisively threw the clothes away. Nanheng suddenly clicked his tongue. I asked you to throw it away, but you didn't. You even said that you wanted to keep it as a souvenir. Your man just casually said 3 words, and you threw it away? That's right. Otherwise, why would he be my man? Jinwan glanced at him, and then smiled at Mo Jingshan. Mo Jingshan's expression did not change, but it was clear that his mood was good because of Jinwan's words. The corners of his lips turned up slightly. Nanheng smiled insincerely. You're just forcing dog food on people. I really wonder if there's anyone who can coexist peacefully in front of you. There is. Feng Ling is very calm. Jinwan glanced at him indifferently. And no matter how I show off my love, Feng Ling's heart is unmoved. She doesn't even seem to have any interest in things like love and men. Nanheng. That night, Jinwan was finally able to sleep peacefully by Mo Jingshan's side. However, in her dreams, she held onto his hand tightly and did not let go. It was only when the sky was about to brighten that her fingers gradually loosened due to her deep sleep. After the storm of the past few days, Jinwan was very sensitive here. However, because Mo Jingshan was by her side, she could finally sleep peacefully. However, she was still afraid that if anything happened, he would suddenly disappear from her sight. After a night of peaceful sleep, they slept peacefully. Early in the morning, Jinwan turned over. In this kind of warehouse, every cubicle was occupied. The conditions were not very good. The environment was too stuffy. There were no windows or air conditioning. There was only a small fan on the ground, blowing against the bed and causing the bedsheets to sway. Her hand was slightly cold. She did not touch Mo Jingshan. Jinwan subconsciously opened her eyes and glanced to the side. As expected, he was not there. Jinwan panicked and rushed to get off the bed. However, because the cubicle was too small and the fan was too close, her foot tripped over the electric wire. Her entire body fell to the ground. Thankfully, her hands were fast, and she pressed against the side of the bed. She did not fall too badly, and only knelt heavily on the ground. Due to the electric wire being kicked down, the fan stopped working and fell to the ground. Jinwan hissed in pain. She staggered, and was about to stand up with the support of the bed, when the cubicle door was suddenly pushed open. Hearing the sound, Mo Jingshan, who had rushed over, saw Jinwan half kneeling on the ground and immediately came over to help her up. Why did you fall? Didn't you notice the electric wire on the ground? Seeing that he was still fine, Jinwan momentarily forgot about the pain in her knee. She released a long breath. I saw that you weren't here and thought you. She paused and glanced at the electric wire on the ground. She pursed her lips and said, I'll be more careful next time. I won't be so careless in the future. Knowing that she was still a little scared, Mo Jingshan did not expose her brave armor. He held her hand and glanced at the bandaged area. Remember to change your dressing today. It's not good to keep your hand bandaged in a tropical area like this. Tell the base doctor to pay more attention. Don't overlook your hand injury. Chapter 307. Mo Jingshan knew that Jinwan would be more sensible in such an environment. She knew her limits. She did not wish to cause trouble for others, so he did not say more. He pinched her sleepy little face. Go wash up and eat something. At this moment, someone called out to him from outside. It sounded like someone was calling Mr. Mo. He glanced at Jinwan. Seeing that she had already turned to retrieve the toothbrush and toothpaste Feng Ling had prepared for her, he turned to leave. Jinwan left the warehouse and was brushing her teeth against the grass by the side when she suddenly heard a loud noise from the forest. It was deafening, causing her hands to tremble. Mo Jingshan had just brought her a bowl of porridge when he heard the noise. He placed the things in his hands down and headed toward the forest. Jinwan wanted to call out to him, but her mouth was stuffed with the toothbrush. The white foam stuck to the corner of her lips. She rushed to rinse her mouth with water. By the time she turned back, Mo Jingshan had already walked far away. Mrs. Mo, don't go over. Seeing that Jinwan was about to follow, Feng Ling rushed over to press her shoulder. A large area of the forest has been detonated. There will be a series of explosions. You don't have to worry. Then what are they going to do? Jinwan's intuition told her that Imo Jingshan's gaze had suddenly darkened. Something must have happened. Then she saw more than 20 people in the base, rushing toward the dense forest. They were all dressed in black, with knives and guns at their waists. They looked serious, and the people in front were also wearing bulletproof vests and explosion-proof shields. This scene looked as serious and tense as yesterday in the hinterland of the camp. Nan Heng was nowhere to be found. The leader of the group was currently giving out orders. Jinwan asked, "Did something happen inside?" "Last night, I heard that their leader, the one named Akib, escaped." "He escaped, but they won't be able to escape from this forest." Feng Ling tried her best not to hide anything from Jinwan to prevent her imagination from running wild. She directly said, "But I didn't expect Akib to be so scheming. They had already kidnapped 8 children from the village on the other side of Tunnel Sap Lake and locked them near a minefield behind the forest. Right now they can't escape, but they are using the lives of those innocent children to threaten us, demanding that we let them leave the forest safely. Otherwise those children will." 8 children? Jinwan frowned. "Yes, the average age of those children is less than 6 years old, and they've been locked up for a few days. We don't know how they're doing for the time being. But Nan Heng just sent a message, saying that a child accidentally ran into a minefield in order to escape, causing the entire minefield to explode. What about the child?" "Dead." Feng Ling's voice was heavy. "1 dead. 7 left. The average age of these children was less than 6 years old. How deranged were these people? They actually captured so many children to be his escape plan. A group of innocent children had been implicated because of their conflict with Akib's group. They did have the responsibility to save those children." While Jinwan was thinking, Imo Jingshan had already returned. His gaze swept past her and landed on Feng Ling. Finally he looked at Jinwan. "Wash up and go eat." Seeing his expression, Jinwan asked, "Are you going in with them?" "Yes. But you are still injured. Don't move. Besides, Nan Heng and the people from the base, including Officer Entz, are enough. There's no need for you to go. Akib's target is me." Jinwan's voice was immediately choked in her throat. She wanted to speak, but right now he no longer had the time to speak. He only indicated for Feng Ling to bring Jinwan back to the room in the warehouse. Jinwan's voice was tense. "You are injured." Imo Jingshan glanced at her. "Soon, those children will lose their lives." Jinwan's ears suddenly rang with the sound of the explosion. Thinking of the scene of those innocent children being blown to death, she felt as though all the blood in her body was flowing backwards. She found it difficult to breathe, although she knew that those innocent children were implicated because of them. Although she knew that Imo Jingshan would not sit back and watch. But there was still a selfish corner of her heart that wanted her to open her mouth and beg him not to go. After a pause, Jinwan said, "I'll go with you. You stay here." He decisively cut her off. "Feng Ling, watch over her. But you're injured like this. If I go with you, I might still be able to. You stay here obediently. You're not allowed to go anywhere." These few words were unprecedentedly stern. Imo Jingshan expressionlessly stared at Jinwan. It was almost an order. Jinwan froze in her spot and did not move. Imo Jingshan gave Feng Ling a look. Feng Ling directly went to hold Jinwan's hand. Jinwan opened her mouth to say something, but in the end, she could only close it. She could not say a single word. Imo Jingshan turned toward the group of people. After taking several steps, he suddenly tilted his head to the side. "Stay here well. Don't get hurt." It had been more than an hour since Imo Jingshan and the others flew into the forest on the helicopter. A series of explosions rang out. It was unknown where the landmines had been stepped on, but it was also unknown which side had opened fire. Here, Jinwan could only hear the various sounds of explosions in the forest. She could not hear anything else. She ran out of the warehouse uncontrollably and looked inside. Feng Ling was also relatively silent. She did not comfort or persuade her as she usually would. It was clear that Akib had set up an ambush near the dangerous minefield. This was not an ambush, but an unavoidable ground full of bombs. No matter how powerful a person was, it was very likely that they would not be able to withstand this kind of danger. The person Jinwan was most worried about was Mo Jingshan, and the person Feng Ling had to worry about, aside from Mr. Mo, was also Nan Heng, and the group of brothers who had gone through life and death with her. Jinwan recalled that before Mo Jingshan went to sleep yesterday, he had helped her switch the electric fan to the lowest setting. When she straightened her back, her body trembled in pain and she almost fell. In this state, if he went in, how was he going to save those children? She suddenly turned to Feng Ling. The person you care about the most is here. Would you rather go in with him? Even if you die together with him, it's still better than worrying alone outside? Feng Ling paused. Obviously, Jinwan's words had hit her heart, but she still said mildly, Mr. Mo said that I must watch over you. You can't go anywhere. Jinwan looked at a small helicopter parked not far away, and then at the key on Feng Ling's waist. She suddenly curved her lips and said meaningfully, I'm quite good at driving. I've always been good at controlling the direction. I heard that this kind of helicopter is not as complicated as a commercial plane. Tell me, can I drive it? Mrs. Mo, don't be impulsive. Feng Ling, my man, is there. No. Chapter 308. The location of the incident was the minefield in the forest closest to Tunnel Sap Lake. Dolly and several of his subordinates had escorted Akib here. They had already abducted the children from the nearby farms. Indeed, as Feng Ling had said, of the 8 children, 1 had already died. When the explosion rang out, the 7 young children watched in horror and confusion as their little friend was suddenly thrown into the air by the explosion. Blood splattered everywhere, and he fell to the ground like a piece of charred wood. They were clearly little friends who had grown up together. A few days ago, they had even played and laughed together. Today he was lying in the charred flames. His entire body was black, and blood was dripping from his body. He was motionless. The police asked them to let the children go, and they could negotiate. However, Akib's only condition was for Mo Jingshan to personally talk to them. Rather than talk to them face to face, it would be more accurate to say that the 7 children's bargaining chips were not big. Their biggest bargaining chip was still Mo Jingshan. Either they used Mo Jingshan to exchange for the 7 children's lives, or these 7 children would accompany them to be buried in this minefield. Furthermore, there were already fuses buried near the minefield. If they could not come to an agreement, none of the people who entered this area would be able to escape. The entire forest would explode one after another, and the area several miles around Tunnel Sap Lake would be affected by the explosion. When Jinwan and Feng Ling rushed to the scene, the police and 11 base members that Ince had brought along had already set up a cordon. The minefield was separated from the safe zone. Akib, Dolly, and the others were already surrounded. However, because the 7 children's lives were in their hands, they could not charge in recklessly. Officer Ince did not approach to question them when he saw that they were people brought by Feng Ling. Right now, he did not have the time to deal with anyone. He even angrily pushed away his subordinates who were whispering suggestions to him. He only watched the 7 frightened children as he racked his brains to think of a solution. Officer Ince looked at Feng Ling, and Feng Ling Jinwan did not go over to disturb the officer. She saw that their helicopters were parked behind, and she did not see Mo Jingshan. She felt uneasy and approached the people from 11 base, attempting to gather information. After asking for a long time, the answer she finally came up with was this. One of the children had indeed died, and the remaining 7 might not be able to be rescued at all. However, they could not just give up on these innocent children. When the Cambodian local police heard the news, they said that they would immediately arrange for reinforcements. However, they had not arrived yet. It was likely that they were waiting for the minefields to be detonated before coming over to deal with the aftermath. The 7 children were covered in blood. Over the past few days, they had either been beaten or scolded. Some who had fainted from hunger had been beaten awake by them. Now these children were forced to stay by Akib's side. No matter what they did, they would hurt the children. The child who had been killed in the explosion was only 6 years old. He had been making too much noise and had tried to escape. In the end, he had stepped into a minefield and been shot by Akib's men. Outside the cordon, Jinwon couldn't see the specific situation inside, nor could she see Akib's group. But just by listening, Jinwon already had a clear and shocking picture in her mind. On the other side, Mo Jingshan calmly watched the people guarding the cabin door. These people were all Nan Heng's subordinates. They had been guarding outside the cabin door for a long time, preventing him from personally appearing at Akib's side. Around the helicopter, in the depths of the forest, there were lush greenery everywhere. The originally peaceful environment was now charred black and filled with an austere atmosphere. In the dense forest surrounded by layers of police, Akib's group could vaguely be seen moving about. Due to the safety of the children, no one dared to charge in. Nan Heng. Mo Jingshan glanced at Nan Heng, who had just returned. Have your men retreat. Before Nan Heng could speak, at this moment, the surrounding police suddenly retreated in large numbers. From a small circle to a larger circle, their footsteps were hurried and urgent. The reason was that one of the children had suddenly rushed out. He ran alone, and the others frantically followed him. The 7 children's cries were filled with fear and misery. Akib's men directly raised their guns and fired several shots into the air. The group of children were frightened into kneeling on the ground and did not dare to move. The scene was extremely chaotic. In an instant, they pulled the children back and mercilessly pressed the muzzle of the gun against their heads. The children were crying. The police kept shouting, attempting to pacify the children and the furious Akib's subordinates. Akib's men were shouting for the children to squat down and not allow them to run around. The children were so frightened that their bodies trembled as they squatted down. Their small bodies were curled into a ball, covered in dirt and blood. Those people were still talking to Officer Entz. Officer Entz looked at the children's frightened and despairing eyes and gestured for the surrounding people to retreat further, step by step. The helicopter that Mo Jingshan was in was less than 10 meters away from them. The cabin door was tightly guarded by Nan Heng's men. Just as those people raised their guns to the children's heads and pulled the trigger, Mo Jingshan did not think twice and directly went down the cabin door to go over. He did not know that Jinwon was already not far behind the helicopter. He did not know that the scene of him walking out of the helicopter had entered her eyes. Thus, when Akib's impatient gunshot was aimed at one of the children's legs, Jinwon saw Mo Jingshan abruptly push aside the group of people blocking in front of him. She only heard the gunshot. From her position, she could only see Mo Jingshan's figure flash by. However, with just a quick glance, Jinwon also saw that the back of his white t-shirt had already begun to bleed. He must have used too much force when he pushed those people away. The wound on his back could not be easily pulled, so it must have opened up again. The wound had just been treated by the base doctor last night. Right now, it must have worsened again. Officer Entz was currently holding a walkie-talkie to speak with Nan Heng's men. 11 bases people were able to receive the information and make a decision in time. Jinwon could not approach, but by listening, she roughly understood the situation inside. For example, a child's calf had been pierced by a bullet, and the ground was covered in blood. The group of children was scared silly. They did not even dare to cry. They all squatted there like mutes, staring in horror at the blood slowly flowing past their feet. Another example was that Akib's feet should be the spot where they had set up an ambush to detonate the minefield. If they did not let them leave, or if they did not allow Mo Jingshan to talk to him face to face, he would immediately detonate the minefield and bring the hundreds of people here down with him. Chapter 309. Looking at the child whose legs were crippled, the crowd was silent. No one spoke, but the 11 bases men's hands tightened on their guns. Akib was truly impatient. From the start, he had already prepared for the worst. He pointed his gun at the children's backs, his feet moving slowly on the ground. The moment the police dared to make a move, he could instantly detonate the bomb here. Not a single one of them could live. The crowd watched this scene. Only Jinwon did not. As the crowd continued to retreat, she could finally see Mo Jingshan through the gaps in the crowd. She stared at Mo Jingshan. Everyone was retreating except for him, who was moving forward. When Mo Jingshan's figure finally appeared, Akib's raging expression finally calmed down. Mr. Mo. Officer Ince was about to step forward to stop him, but was stopped by Mo Jingshan's slightly raised arm. I'll go over. Mo Jingshan's tone was mild. Nan Hung, who stood by the side, knew that he could not stop him at this time. He gave the brothers in the base a look, and everyone raised their guns, preparing to move at any moment. However, the two sides were in a deadlock. Neither side dared to move. Mo Jingshan's appearance attracted the attention of everyone on Akib's side. Jinwan watched as Mo Jingshan walked into the danger zone. She glanced at the surrounding people, and carefully hid behind the crowd. Behind this circle of people, there was a person slowly moving his feet bit by bit. Akib's men's attention was focused on Mo Jingshan, Officer Ince, and Nan Hung. As long as they did not make any suspicious movements or commands, it meant that they were temporarily safe. Without their orders, no one dared to make a move. Just as Feng Ling, who had arrived at the last moment, was preparing to sneak an attack, she saw that Jin Wan had already walked around the crowd. Her expression faltered. She wanted to rush over, but she could not make any movements right now. She softened her footsteps and chased after her. While everyone was watching Mo Jingshan's footsteps, Akib glanced at Dolly. Dolly sneered. He was already prepared to use Mo Jingshan as the final bargaining chip to save his life. However, they did not notice that there was someone behind them. All of the police officers were still moving backward. Akib saw that Mo Jingshan was about to enter his reach, and was about to blurt out the conditions he had prepared for the negotiation. He did not notice anything strange. It was at this moment that Mo Jingshan and Nan Hung noticed the white figure at the back of the crowd. As Mo Jingshan's footsteps abruptly paused, Nan Hung suddenly raised his hand. Bang! A gunshot rang out. Nan Hung fired a shot toward the sky. Just as Akib and the others' attention was diverted and Akib was about to raise his gun to aim at Mo Jingshan, another unexpected gunshot rang out from behind. Bang! It was not as heavy as Nan Hung's spear, but it tore through the air almost imperceptibly. Before Akib could react when he heard the sound, he was suddenly shot in the shoulder. His hand that was holding the gun lost its balance, and he swayed forward. At this critical moment, Nan Hung and Officer Ince each fired at Akib and his men's heads. Because Akib and his men were too shrewd, they had calculated their numbers from the start. Each person's position was closely watched by them, and they were unable to successfully sneak past them. They planned to strike first. This shot that no one expected had indeed opened the door for them to strike first. Feng Ling had already rushed over. Feng Ling rushed over and stared in disbelief at Jin Wan, who had just fired a shot. She abruptly stepped forward, pressed her hand down, and dragged her to hide behind a tree to avoid being shot by Akib's men. At the same time, she glanced at the gun in Jin Wan's hand. Mrs. Mo, why do you have a gun? Jin Wan had yet to recover from the shock of actually being able to fire a shot. She stared blankly at Feng Ling, before slowly returning to her senses. Yesterday, Jing Shin placed a gun in my sleeve. Earlier on, before you and I rushed over, I brought it with me. But I didn't expect that I would really be able to use it. Seeing Jin Wan's dazed expression, Feng Ling held back her laughter and said, Good job. At the same time, Feng Ling directly took the gun. She fiddled with it for a moment before handing it back to her. Put it away. I'll put the trigger back in. Don't accidentally hurt yourself. Jin Wan recalled how she had fired the gun earlier. She was truly dazed and suddenly felt a little terrified. Forget it, I'll just not hold it. Before we leave Cambodia, keep it on you for self-defense. Without another word, Feng Ling placed the gun back into her sleeve. She then pulled Jin Wan and turned to leave. Come with me first. It's not safe here. At this moment, a loud shout suddenly came from the crowd. A police officer who had just surrounded them shouted in English. Dolly has a bomb on him. He's going to launch a suicide attack. However, there was a limit to how fast a person could react. By the time everyone realized what was going on, when everyone's guns were pointed at them, no one dared to fire at Dolly. Everyone was moving at a high speed. It was impossible to aim 100%. Once someone shot Dolly, no one dared to imagine what would happen. After all, there were bombs below them, and they were surrounded by minefields. Dolly also had a bomb on him, But could they just let Dolly jump into the crowd and cause the first explosion? In that instant, Mo Jingshan, who was being held back by the police and was only a few meters away from Dolly, pushed the crowd aside. Dolly sneered and raised his gun to shoot himself. In an instant that no one expected, the white figure suddenly pounced toward him. Dolly was about to shoot himself. Dolly, who was standing several meters away from Mo Jingshan, suddenly threw himself at him. Moreover, he succeeded in pressing Dolly under his body. Unexpectedly, Mo Jingshan, who was injured and had been protected by the police, suddenly came over. Dolly was knocked to the ground, and the gun in his hand fell to the ground. It slipped out of his hand and slid forward a few meters. He hurriedly reached out to grab it back, but the person on his back held him down. Dolly simply turned around and wrestled with the person on his back. It was Mo Jingshan. Behind the crowd, Jin Wan was being dragged away by Feng Ling. When she saw the scene inside, she almost screamed out loud. Dolly's body was tied with a bomb. Mo Jingshan's upper body was dressed in white, and a large patch of blood had already seeped out of his back. The police watched this scene in shock. For several seconds, no one dared to step forward. Only the people from 11 Base were about to rush in to save Mr. Mo, but were warned by Officer Ince's men not to go over. The bomb on Dolly's body could explode at any moment due to the scuffle. Chapter 310. Nan Hung could not stand Officer Ince's cautious personality. Without thinking, he abruptly pulled out his gun and fired at Dolly's leg. At the same time as his gunshot, another gunshot rang out. It was Feng Ling, who was standing by Jin Wan's side. She had fired accurately and moved at the same frequency as him. The bullet also struck Dolly's other leg at the same time. Dolly's face contorted in pain. He was still half a meter away from the gun on the ground, but he still had to struggle to reach it. Mo Jingshan endured the pain and stood up, rushing forward. Meanwhile, Dolly was still crawling on the ground. The moment Mo Jingshan picked up the gun, his gaze shifted. He only hesitated for half a second before pulling the trigger and aiming it at Dolly's forehead. Nan Hung furrowed his brows and abruptly leaped forward. Pung. A sound. Nan Hung's shot directly struck Dolly's forehead. Pung. Another sound. Another hit. Pung. Another sound. It was Mo Jingshan who had accurately shot Dolly in the middle of his forehead when he was about to die with his eyes wide open. Dolly's eyes instantly closed. He was completely dead. Fresh blood flowed down the grass beneath him. You. Nan Hung's hand stiffened. His gaze was astonished. Back then, Mo Jingshan had promised Elder Mo that he would not involve himself in the underworld, would not stain his hands with blood, and would not take human lives. But no matter how Nan Hung tried to stop him, he still killed Dolly with his own hands. Mo Jingshan did not explain. As he tossed the gun aside, his gaze coldly stared at the dead man on the ground. His tone was mild. Come and defuse the bomb. Don't waste words. Nan Hung. He turned to look coldly at Officer Ince, who was still hesitating on whether to approach. By the time Officer Ince reacted and was about to call for help, the people from 11 Base had already rushed over. Jin Wan stood outside the crowd. Her hand was held tightly by Feng Ling. She looked at the man whose back was already soaked in blood. Her heart was filled with an indescribable feeling. She only felt that her eyes were instantly wet. Only she knew why Mo Jingshan insisted on killing Dolly with his own hands. Because when she was trapped in the camp for days, it was Dolly who kept beating her, kicking her, and threatening her. It was also Dolly who forced her to kneel down in front of Mo Jingshan to save her life. It was also Dolly who said he was going to use Jin Wan as an appetizer. This man had become a nightmare that Jin Wan couldn't get rid of in the short term. This spear shot at the brink of death was worth it. That plain white t-shirt was now stained with blood, and it was impossible to tell whose blood it was. Finally, the police rushed over and took away the children who needed to be taken away. Those who needed to be defused did so, and those who needed to check the bodies of Akib and his accomplices went to check the bodies. Jin Wan took the opportunity when Feng Ling's hand finally loosened a little to abruptly pull her hand out and rush toward him. There were policemen all around, and they all recognized her. No one intended to stop her. Mr. Mo, your injury is now. The people at the base were about to ask him to hurry back and bandage his wound. It's fine. Take these children away first. Mo Jingshan was covered in blood, and his eyes were cold. He just stood there, but no one dared to approach him. Jinwan ran to his side, supported him, and asked anxiously, "How are you?" He seemed to realize that it was really Jinwan who broke the deadlock, and suddenly shot Akib in the back. Jinwan pressed her hand against his arm, and was about to continue speaking when she suddenly felt a pain in her hand. The man abruptly pulled her away, and held her hand tightly in his palm. The pain made her face pale, and she looked at him in surprise. "What did I tell you before I left? Didn't I tell you to wait where you are?" The man's eyes were cold and sharp. When he looked at her, there was not the slightest warmth in his eyes. The coldness in his eyes made Jinwan freeze on the spot. Her mouth moved, but for a moment she couldn't speak. She couldn't explain a word. Should she say that she was worried about him? Or should she say something to coax him not to be angry? No matter what she said, she couldn't stop the blood from flowing out of his back. Jinwan abruptly held his arm with force, holding on with all her might to prevent him from pushing her away. She said calmly, "The injury on your back can't be ignored anymore. Let's go back and find a doctor. His injury should be very serious." Earlier, not only did his wound tear, but he had also been attacked several times in the same spot. The injury that had already penetrated deep into his flesh was most likely even more serious now. Mo Jingshan did not move much before Jinwan forcefully pulled him away. Jinwan held him, passing by the terrible blood and mess on the ground. She did not even glance at it. She only wanted to take Mo Jingshan away from this place. The police and the people at the base were all busy. The gloomy weather that had been gloomy all morning suddenly became gloomy, until it began to rain. Jinwan raised her head to look up. As she supported Mo Jingshan toward the direction of the helicopter, she asked, "It's raining. Will there still be any danger of explosions here?" "Yes, most of the landmines here were buried during the war decades ago. The dense forest is thick with branches and leaves. The rain is not heavy, so it won't penetrate through. The ground is still dry. If the rain gets heavier, the areas that need to be exploded will still explode, but they won't be connected together. The area of explosion will shrink, and the forest won't be on fire." After speaking, Mo Jingshan suddenly coughed. Jinwan rushed to support him. "Those children have been rescued. Leave the rest to the police. Let's go find a doctor first." Before she finished, all of a sudden, there was a pung sound from behind them. A gunshot. Very close. Jinwan's entire body trembled. Before she could react, she was abruptly pressed into Mo Jingshan's arms. In the next moment, the bullet almost brushed past their shoulders and landed heavily on the helicopter, leaving a deep dent in the hard steel body. Jinwan raised her head from Mo Jingshan's arms to see that Akib, who had been pretending to be dead for a long time, was lying on the ground covered in blood. With only one breath left, he actually took the opportunity when the police were dealing with the bomb on Dolly's body to shoot them. Thankfully, Feng Ling was close. She reacted quickly and fired at the same time, hitting Akib's wrist. This shot that was originally aimed at killing them was directly deflected. Following that, Feng Ling expressionlessly walked toward Akib step by step. She shot at various parts of his body. Akib's entire body twitched as the bullets continuously pierced through him. Finally, he breathed his last breath. Jinwan looked at Akib, who was covered in bloody holes, and was completely stunned. It was not until the man who had been protecting her in his arms suddenly went limp and knelt on the ground that Jinwan subconsciously raised her hand to hold him. Due to the difference in height and weight, she almost lost her balance and fell backward. She hurriedly tried to stand up. "Jingshan!" Jinwan hugged Mo Jingshan tightly as he suddenly fell on her. She felt the blood flowing down his back. Earlier, when he suddenly turned around to avoid the bullet, his wound had been aggravated by this movement. Chapter 311. Mr. Mo, we'll take you back right away. The doctor is already waiting. Feng Ling came quickly and was about to help Jinwan hold him. But Jinwan had already stood firmly. She looked down at him and said clearly, "Mo Jingshan, If anything happens to you, I'll remarry with the child in my belly, and let your child call someone else dad. Feng Ling. She suddenly felt it was not appropriate to reach out to help him. The man who fell on Jinwan suddenly chuckled. He leaned against her shoulder and chuckled hoarsely. His voice was so hoarse and weak that it was almost breathless, but it was still full of threat. How dare you? If anything happens to you, I'll dare to remarry. If you don't believe me, try it. Jinwan resisted the sourness in her nose, hugged him tightly, gave Feng Ling a look, and helped Mo Jingshan into the helicopter with Feng Ling. I'll call someone to send you back right away. We'll deal with the aftermath. Feng Ling helped Mo Jingshan sit in the helicopter with Jinwan, and then quickly walked out. Seeing the blood on Mo Jingshan's body, Jinwan was about to lift his clothes to have a look, but her hand was held by the man and pulled down. Mo Jingshan sat on the soft chair in the airport, panted, and said without looking back, narrowed his eyes. What did you say just now? I'm not dead yet, and you're thinking of remarrying. It was the first time she had seen Mo Jingshan injured like this. In the past, he had never even had a headache or fever in front of her. Suddenly, he was so weak that she was really afraid that something would happen to him. She was so anxious that she tried to threaten him to hold on. The man suddenly looked at her murderously. Who do you dare to marry? Jinwan pursed her lips. The premise is that you don't die. You have to live well, and keep an eye on me every day. Then I can't run away. She couldn't speak out her emotions. Seeing him injured like this, she couldn't get emotional at all. But she didn't want him to worry too much, so she could only try to calm down. Mo Jingshan looked at her sideways, and saw the emotions she had been hiding. I won't die. He raised his hand with some difficulty, and stroked her soft hair as usual. I am yours and my life is also yours. I won't let go easily. Don't think too much. Tell Feng Ling that there's no rush to send us back. Defuse the bombs first. Earlier, the landmines around us didn't explode. The people from the base must have found the fuse and cut it off first. Now the danger is mostly gone. Remember to negotiate with the Cambodian local police. There are still many landmines around. Tell them to be careful and not to get too close. Jinwan listened attentively, nodding as she listened. She would convey the message to Feng Ling later. But his voice was getting softer and softer. In the end, there was only silence. She glanced sideways and saw that Mo Jingshan's eyes were closed. His face was pale, and his body was covered in blood. However, even though he had fainted, his hand still held hers without letting go. The danger in the jungle was finally over. When the helicopter took off, Mo Jingshan had already woken up. It was raining outside the cabin. Although the rain wasn't heavy, it did have a small effect. It delayed the detonation of the newly buried landmines underground, giving them more time to search and clear the mines. Akib and his men were all captured, dead or injured. Have the children been sent back? Jinwan asked. Regardless of whether it was Akib's death or Dali's death, this group of evil people could not be treated as humans. Thus, even though she saw this bloody scene, she didn't feel much pity. She only sighed a little. However, the thing that weighed heavily on her heart was the innocent child who had died. Not yet. The base doctor will first treat the children's injuries before sending them back. We don't want to scare their parents, Feng Ling replied. 6 of the children have minor abrasions. One of them was shot in both legs. The bullet pierced through his leg bones. He's destined to be crippled for life. As for the one who was blown up, Feng Ling paused. Every time she was sent out on a dangerous mission, she was used to seeing life and death. However, she still couldn't bear to see innocent children get hurt, especially since the average age of these children was less than 6 years old. The dead can't be brought back to life. We'll think of a way to comfort their parents. We can give them some money, or other ways to comfort them. Then leave more money. If the base doesn't have enough money, I can also provide some. I can still afford to help these children grow up, Jinwan said. Feng Ling glanced at her but didn't speak. All of a sudden, Jinwan heard the man who had been resting by her side let out a low chuckle. It was very mild. She turned to look at Mo Jingshan. Why aren't you closing your eyes to rest? What are you laughing about? 11 Base is Nanhang's territory. He's a famous arms dealer in both the black and white worlds. His money is beyond your imagination. There's no need for you to do anything. Mo Jingshan's lips were slightly pale, and his voice was low. Nanheng was not on the plane right now. Jinwan had no choice but to find something to distract herself. Otherwise, if she kept looking at the wound on Mo Jingshan's back, her heart would be in pain. Since he's so powerful, why does it seem like he's under your control? It seems like he doesn't dare to offend you at all. Jinwan moved closer to Mo Jingshan's ear and whispered. She didn't want Feng Ling to hear these words, but Feng Ling's hearing was extremely good. Mo Jingshan's pale, handsome brows only moved slightly. He smiled lightly and didn't say anything. However, Feng Ling directly said, because Nanheng first mingled in the underworld in America. Now that he's able to traverse both the black and white worlds, it's all because of Mr. Mo. Without Mr. Mo's help, it wouldn't be so easy for him to clear his name. You mean that on the path of the underworld, no one can control Nanheng, but on the path of clearing his name, Mo Jingshan is the boss above him. Feng Ling pursed her lips. And that's roughly what I mean. In other words, Nanheng is 11 Base's boss, and Mo Jingshan is Nanheng's boss. So 11 Base also belongs to Mo Jingshan? You can say that. Jinwan's expression suddenly changed. No wonder that day when I washed the socks, the group of people in your base had such expressions. Everyone knew that she was Mrs. Mo. She suddenly understood their feelings very well. What socks? Mo Jingshan's voice suddenly interrupted Jinwan and Feng Ling's conversation. This was not the first time he heard these words. Mo Jingshan's gaze directly landed on Jinwan's face. Feng Ling. She suddenly didn't dare to speak anymore. She only used her gaze to look at Jinwan. Jinwan wanted to use this matter to make a joke to ease her feelings, but she turned to look at the blood on the man's body. The scene of blood splattering everywhere from the gunshot earlier was still vivid in her mind. Chapter 312. The people of 11 Base were responsible for sending the children back to the farm. Everyone packed up and prepared to leave Tunnel Sap Lake before dark. Because of Mo Jingshan's injuries and the other injured people's conditions, they had to go to the hospital in the Cambodian capital first, and then return to America the next morning. Jinwan asked if she was going back to America with them. Nanheng only replied that Mo Jingshan was going to America. Shouldn't she go? The answer was of course to go. At this moment, Mo Jingshan sat on a chair in the Cambodian treatment room. The doctors and nurses kept making a fuss. Occasionally, they couldn't help but say a lot because of the severity of the injury on Mo Jingshan's back. As they tended to his wounds, they stared at his incomparably handsome face and kept looking for opportunities to say more. Jinwan couldn't understand what they were talking about. When she saw the female doctor and nurse staring at Mo Jingshan's face and back, her heart instantly felt as though a bottle of vinegar had been poured onto a flame. It was hot and sour. However, she couldn't act up at this moment. Mo Jingshan's injuries were too serious. The doctors were tending to his wounds. She couldn't possibly run over to help him put on a shirt and then take him away from the hospital. However, no matter what the doctors and nurses were saying, and no one knew if Mo Jingshan understood them or not, he just sat there quietly. When Jinwan suddenly got up to go out to take a breath, he stopped her. "Where are you going?" She looked at him. Although the man did not even frown when he was enduring the pain, his forehead was still slightly sweaty. He allowed the nurses to stitch up his wounds with tweezers and needle. Although the veins on the back of his hands were clearly visible, he did not make a sound. He only opened his eyes to look at her. "I'll go get a glass of water," Jinwan said, and went out to find a water dispenser. She would never say that it was because the nurses had been staring at his face and saying a lot of things. They helped him disinfect and leaned down to his shoulder to whisper softly into his ear. This scene almost knocked over her bottle of vinegar. It's not the right time to be jealous, but she doesn't understand their Cambodian language, which makes her even more nervous. She doesn't want them to be careless when treating the wound, so she just goes out for a walk. But Jinwan couldn't go out for too long. Feng Ling was outside. After chatting with Feng Ling for a while, she poured a glass of water and went back. Then he held the cup of water and watched the scene inside. Mo Jingshan's blood-stained shirt was tossed on the ground. His entire body was covered in dust, and there was an indistinct bruise on his brow bone. Because she was finally back. The man raised his eyebrows slightly and looked at her from the corner of his eye. He smiled faintly, as if he had already seen the jealousy in her eyes. He just sat there, dirty and disheveled but damn handsome. This was the first time Jin-won realized that a person's good looks did not only come from their clean and presentable appearance. Although Mo Jingshan's appearance was indeed God's most outstanding creation, at this moment, this man's handsomeness was not the faint and noble appearance she was familiar with. Instead, it was the masculinity that flowed from his bones. He did not wear the expensive suit he usually wore, nor did he tidy up his incomparably handsome appearance. But right now his attractiveness was fatal. Thus, it was understandable that these female doctors and nurses would be infatuated with him under the pretense of treating his wound. The stitching of his wound continued until 9:30 p.m. Mo Jingshan finally put on his clothes. Before taking the plane back to America, everyone took the opportunity to relax and found a decent noodle shop near the hospital. They ordered several bowls of beef noodles to be delivered to the hospital. Because Mo Jingshan's wound had been stitched up, he could not move for the time being. Thus, the task of feeding Boss Missouri food naturally fell onto Jin-won. Jin-won stood before Mo Jingshan. As she stirred the noodles in the bowl, she said, "A few days ago, when I fed you food for the first time, you spilled the soup in the bowl." Mo Jingshan faltered. He could clearly sense that she wanted to settle the score with him later. Under those circumstances, it would only be a problem if I ate it. Although the two of them were well aware of this, he still explained. Jin-won immediately rolled her eyes at him. "Then when I fed you water, you should have continued to treat me coldly. Why did you suddenly tease me?" Mo Jingshan. Although she said that, Jin-won could not bear to let him starve right now. Right now, he was a heavily injured patient and needed to be taken care of. Mo Jingshan watched as the little woman carefully blew on the slightly hot noodles and then fed it to his mouth. He looked at her and chuckled lightly. "You didn't manage to feed me once or twice, so you have to find an opportunity to feed me again, right? Don't tell me you can't even lift your arms and shoulders right now." Jin-won directly pressed the noodles to his lips. "The doctor said that before the wound heals, you can't move your shoulders or back. Otherwise it'll easily tear again. When that happens, it'll be difficult." The man looked at her serious expression and curved his lips. He gave her face and ate the noodles she fed him. Earlier, Jin-won had taken a few bites from the other bowl. The Cambodian people's taste was different from that in China. Although this noodle soup was made by a very good noodle restaurant near the hospital, she didn't like the taste in the noodle soup. It was sour but not sweet, and it was salty. In short, she just couldn't get used to it. Thankfully, the broth was clean, and the noodles were relatively soft. Noodles nourished the stomach and were easy to digest. It was suitable for people who were temporarily injured and could not move around much. Thus, she had to think of a way to let him eat more. After the meal, the people from the base were already preparing to board the plane. Jin-won went to help with the luggage. Mo Jingshan did not stay idle either. He chatted with Nan Hung and Officer Entz for a long time. When Jin-won went to look for him again, she happened to see an extremely bright light outside the helicopter, casting a dazzling glow on his body. His expression was serene, as though nothing he had experienced in the past few days could disturb his calm and steady footsteps. She didn't know what Officer Entz had said to him, but he did not say a word. Only a hint of coldness appeared in his brows. Seeing that Jin-won had come over, Mo Jingshan listened to the doctor's advice and did not move. He only used his eyes to indicate for her to come over. Jin-won quickly approached him and stood in front of him. The lights fell on their bodies, and their shadows intertwined. Cambodia's winter was stifling and hot for many days. Tonight it finally felt cooler. Jin-won faced the direction of Tunnel Sap Lake. Cambodia's night sky was silent. Only the bright stars twinkled. This country was very beautiful. Chapter 313. They finally set off for America. There were only 4 people on this plane: Jinwan, Fengling, Nanheng and Mo Jingshan. Nanheng was covered in the smell of cigarettes. He had just extinguished a cigarette before boarding the plane. Recently, he had smoked more than usual. Fengling sat slightly further away from them. She sat in the seat in front, separated from the driver's seat, and chatted with Jinwan occasionally. Compared to the 2 women's voices, the 2 men in the cabin were much quieter. Nanheng calmly leaned against the seat, folding his arms like a master. He closed his eyes and prepared to sleep. Mo Jingshan turned his body. He could not move around frequently for the time being, so he lazily leaned against the window of the cabin and looked outside. The man's eyelashes cast a gentle shadow on his face. Jinwan almost forgot the thrill she had just experienced. She almost thought that she had just returned from a tropical country, with Great Boss Missouri on a vacation, and was on the return flight. This man always made people feel at ease. A sense of security, belonging and stability. Everything came from him. Jinwan did not know when she had fallen asleep. When she woke up, her head was heavy. She could still hear the sound of the propeller by her ears. She was still on the plane, so she must not have slept for long. However, the dazzling light from the window indicated that they had already flown across half the world. In just a few hours of flight, they had passed through day and night. Originally, she had been feeling uncomfortable because of her morning sickness and other pregnancy symptoms, especially after flying for such a long time. However, right now she felt especially comfortable lying down. She came to her senses under the glaring light and came to her senses. She was lying on Mo Jingshan's lap. He was still injured. Jinwan rushed to climb up and turned to see the man's gaze landing on her face. Mo Jingshan pushed her slightly messy hair behind her ear, gently asking, "Why didn't you sleep a little longer? You're injured, yet you're letting me lean on you. Your body is already stiff and uncomfortable when you can't move. Now that you're carrying my weight, you should have woken me up," Jinwan said as she rushed to check the wound on his back. However, there was no more blood seeping out of his clothes. She sighed in relief. "I only suffered some superficial wounds on my back. It's not like I can't touch my whole body." Mo Jingshan was about to reach out to pick up the blanket that had fallen off her body. She was afraid that he would pull his mouth, so she pressed his hand down and turned to pick up the blanket herself. At this moment, the cabin was a little quiet. They didn't know if Nanheng was really asleep or just taking a nap. Even if he heard the sound, he probably couldn't be bothered to care. Fengling hadn't slept, but she didn't speak either. She leaned against the wall of the cabin and didn't speak. No one knew what she was thinking. Jinwan lowered her voice. "Fengling, aren't you going to sleep? We're almost there. Mrs. Mo, you haven't had much rest these days. Pregnant people like to sleep and get tired easily. It's not good for you to stay with us like this. After we arrive in America, go to the hospital to have a good checkup." Previously, when they were in the Cambodian hospital, there were many injured people who needed urgent treatment. However, they didn't trust the hospital there, so they didn't let Jinwan go for a checkup. Now that they were about to land in America, it was better for her to go for a checkup. "I understand. I'll find some time to go take a look." Jinwan didn't want to cause trouble for them, nor did she want them to worry, so she directly agreed. However, when she heard that they were about to arrive, she subconsciously glanced outside. She could only see the American sky and the warm and dazzling setting sun, shining brightly. It had been many years since she came to America. Her expression was dazed for a moment before she suddenly asked, "Are we going to 11 base? Or are we going to Officer Ence's place? Or, we'll stop at the temporary airport in Los Angeles first. Our people will negotiate with Officer Ence's men. You and Mr. Mo must be sent to the hospital immediately. His wound is deep, and the wound on his head isn't light either. He still needs a series of examinations and follow-up treatment. Your body also needs a further examination. You don't have to worry about anything else. Rest in the hospital. This is no longer Cambodia. There won't be so many scary things nearby. Just relax." As Fengling spoke, she glanced at the time again. "We'll probably land in half an hour. Mrs. Mo, if you feel any discomfort, let me know." I'll have them land as slowly as possible. I'm fine. I can land normally. But Los Angeles, it was actually Los Angeles. That was right. If not Los Angeles, where else could she go? The Emo family's company Shine Group was here. 11 Base was also in the suburbs of Los Angeles. She had also studied abroad in Los Angeles. To Jean Wan, this place could be considered familiar. However, many years had truly passed. Including the 10 years in her previous life, she had crossed over even more years. There were many things that she could not remember clearly when she was young and ignorant. She suddenly felt a warmth in her hand. She turned to see Mo Jingshan's hand holding her, imprisoning her in his palm. As the plane was about to land, it slowly descended and passed by the Los Angeles River. The ancient bridge on First Street above the river was an important hub for entering and exiting Los Angeles. Jean Wan looked down at the Los Angeles River. She suddenly heard Mo Jingshan's voice by her ear. When you were studying in America, did you often come to the Los Angeles River? She did not understand why he would suddenly ask this question. After thinking for a long time, she finally said, "My school was very far from here, so I rarely came to Los Angeles. However, there were a few times when I went out for gatherings with friends and classmates. At night, when I was bored, I would take a walk by the river. I did come here. At that time, I seemed to have gotten separated from them. In the middle of the night, the streetlights by the river were broken. That night was especially dark." Speaking up to here, Jean Wan's eyes brightened. She seemed to have recalled something. "That's right, at that time, I also saved someone from the river. That person was covered in blood. I don't know how he was injured. If I hadn't been quick enough to catch him, he would have been washed downstream. Downstream is a waterfall. It's quite dangerous." Her voice had yet to land when she suddenly felt the man's gaze fixed on her. Jean Wan choked. Her eyes met his. And a memory that she had hidden for a long time and did not place in her heart suddenly leaped up. The difference between mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and a first kiss. She was stunned for a while before she raised her head abruptly and met the man's smiling eyes in disbelief. You're tuning in to the Li Mei's Sword of Destiny YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.